Deep inside a limestone cave in southern France, there's a wall covered in horses. Not just a few horses scattered randomly, but 364 animals painted with such precision that modern zoologists can identify species, sex, even individual behaviours captured mid-motion. Lions stalking bison. Horses mid-gallop with legs blurred into multiple positions, like some kind of prehistoric flipbook. Rhinos fighting, horns locked together in a moment, frozen for over 30,000 years. This isn't decoration, this isn't some caveman doodling to pass the time. This looks like something else entirely. This looks like a record, and that's the question that's been eating at archaeologists for over a century now. Why do so many of these Ice Age paintings feel less like art and more like documentation? Why did people go so deep into total darkness, sometimes crawling for hundreds of feet through passages barely wide enough for a human body, just to paint animals that don't even live in caves? What were they trying to preserve? What were they trying to remember? Or, and this is the part that really keeps researchers up at night, what were they trying to tell someone else? Maybe even someone not yet born? Because here's the thing, some of these images aren't random. They repeat. Same animals, same poses, same combinations across caves, separated by hundreds of miles and thousands of years. Some walls show what look like seasonal patterns, animals in specific reproductive states, specific coat patterns tied to specific times of year. Other panels contain strange geometric marks, dots and lines and shapes that show up again and again, like some kind of code we haven't cracked yet. Were they tracking animal migrations, recording hunting knowledge for the next generation, mapping the stars, marking sacred rituals, or attempting something we don't even have a word for, something between memory and message, between art and information? The honest answer is we don't fully know. Researchers have proposed practical explanations, hunting magic, teaching tools, survival records. They've proposed social explanations, markers of identity, symbols of who belonged to which group. They've proposed spiritual explanations, doorways to altered states, communication with unseen forces. And more recently, they've proposed something even stranger, that some of this might be tracking the sky itself, an early attempt at keeping time using the stars. Now, before we go further, let's clear something up. When people say these paintings are 40,000 years old, that number is really a rough umbrella covering an enormous span of time and geography, from Indonesia to Spain, spanning tens of thousands of years of human creativity. We'll get into exactly what that timeline looks like in a minute. But first, if you're listening to this late at night trying to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now where you are. I check these every morning, and it's wild seeing London at midnight, Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto right before bed, all listening to the same story at completely different hours. And if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to follow the show on Spotify and listen there. Links in the description. Now let's go back, way back. Before writing, before farming, before cities, back to a time when the only way to leave a message for the future was to crawl into the dark and paint it onto stone. So let's actually unpack that number, 40,000 years old. It sounds precise, like a date stamped on a birth certificate. It's not. It's more like saying sometime in the last 5 centuries and lumping together the Renaissance, the printing press, and the moon landing. The truth is messier and honestly more interesting. The period we're talking about is called the Upper Paleolithic, and it doesn't span a few generations. It spans roughly 40,000 years, from around 45,000 years ago all the way to the end of the last ice age around 10,000 years ago. That's longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. Longer than agriculture, cities, empires, and everything we usually think of as history, combined and then doubled. So when a cave gets dated to 40,000 years old, what that really means is archaeologists have pinned a specific painting in a specific chamber to a narrow window within that much larger timeline. Different caves land in wildly different parts of that window. Some paintings are closer to us in time than they are to other paintings in different caves. Think about that for a second. A hunter painting a bison in one cave might be separated from a hunter painting a bison in another cave by more time than separates us from the construction of the Great Pyramid. That's why context matters so much. And context starts with geography. The most famous cluster sits in what researchers call the Franco-Cantabrian region, essentially southern France and northern Spain. This is ground zero for cave art in the popular imagination. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, dozens of smaller sites tucked into limestone hills that happen to be riddled with caves, stable enough to preserve pigment for tens of thousands of years. But it's not the only region, not even close. Head east into what's now southern Germany and you hit the Swabian Jura, a smaller but staggeringly important cluster of caves that gave us some of the oldest figurative art and musical instruments ever found, ivory carvings of lions and mammoths that predate much of the French material. Head south into the Mediterranean and you find scattered sites across Italy and beyond. And then, and this is where things get genuinely mind-bending, head all the way to Indonesia, to the island of Sulawesi, where researchers found paintings of wild pigs and therianthropic hunting scenes that clock in at over 40,000 years old, rivaling anything found in Europe. For decades, the story of cave art was told as a European story. That story is now falling apart in the best possible way, because it turns out humans everywhere were doing this, independently, possibly for reasons that had nothing to do with copying each other. Now, within the European sequence specifically, archaeologists have carved the timeline into named phases. You'll hear these terms thrown around constantly, so let's demystify them. Aurignacian comes first, roughly 43,000 to 33,000 years ago. This is the era of some of the oldest confirmed paintings, including the lions and rhinos of Chauvet. Then comes Gravettian, roughly 33,000 to 22,000 years ago, known for the famous Venus figurines and increasingly complex burial practices. After that, Solutrean, roughly 22,000 to 17,000 years ago, marked by extraordinary advances in stone tool technology, some of the finest flint knapping ever produced by human hands. And finally Magdalenian, roughly 17,000 to 12,000 years ago, the period that gave us Lascaux and Altamira in their full polychrome glory, along with an explosion of engraved bone, antler tools and portable art. But here's the thing you need to hold on to. These phases are not sealed boxes. They're not 4 distinct rooms with doors that shut behind each one. They're loose, overlapping, geographically inconsistent categories that archaeologists use to organize tool styles and artistic trends that shifted gradually and unevenly across different regions. A community in one valley might have been living a Gravettian lifestyle, while a community 200 miles away was still doing things the Aurignacian way. Culture doesn't move in clean waves. It moves in currents and eddies, speeding up here, stalling out there, sometimes reversing entirely. So when you hear these terms, think of them less as historical eras and more as rough dialects of the same evolving language. And that unevenness shows up directly in the art itself, because the styles are all over the map, literally and figuratively. Some of the oldest known markings aren't pictures of anything at all. They're simple marks, dots, lines, hand stencils, made by blowing pigment around a hand pressed against the rock. Move forward or sideways in time and you find outline drawings, animals rendered in a single confident sweep of black manganese or red ochre, nothing but a silhouette, but somehow alive. Move further and you get full polychrome scenes, layered colours, shading that suggests volume and muscle, perspective tricks that make a bison look like it's turning its head toward you. And it's not just paint. Some of the most stunning work in this period is engraved directly into the stone, scratched lines creating texture and depth, or carved in relief so the animal's body actually protrudes from the rock surface, catching torchlight in a way flat paint never could. Different techniques, different tools, different levels of technical mastery, sometimes within the same cave, sometimes even on the same wall. This is exactly where modern assumptions get us into trouble. There's a persistent instinct when people first see Chauvet's lions or Sulawesi's pigs to say something like, "That's too advanced for that time period," as if skill has to arrive gradually, evenly, like a technology upgrade rolling out region by region. But that's not how human ability works, and it never has been. A gifted individual with an unusually sharp eye and steady hand could exist 36,000 years ago just as easily as today. Talent doesn't wait for permission from a timeline. What we're seeing in the archaeological record isn't necessarily a slow climb from crude scribbles to masterpieces. It might be individual genius appearing early, scattered unevenly across populations, sometimes lost for thousands of years afterward, sometimes never repeated at the same level again. Which brings us to the real limitation here, the thing you have to sit with before we go any further. Style alone can tell us roughly when something was made and give us hints about technique, materials, even the artist's individual habits. But style alone cannot tell us why. It can't tell us if that outline of a horse was a teaching tool, a hunting ritual, a record of a real event, or a message meant for someone the artist would never meet. The paint can survive 40,000 years. The intention behind it usually doesn't. And that gap between what we can measure and what we actually want to know is exactly why this mystery has stayed alive for over a century. So now that we know roughly when and where, it's time to ask the harder question. How do we actually know any of these dates are real? We start with the method that sounds the most like sci-fi, radiocarbon. Radiocarbon dating works because a tiny fraction of the carbon in the atmosphere is radioactive. Plants absorb it, animals eat the plants, we eat the animals. Everybody ends up with this gently ticking radioactive clock inside their tissues. When an organism dies, it stops taking in new carbon. The radioactive part decays at a known rate. Measure how much is left, run the math, and you get an age. In caves, though, we almost never date the paint itself. There is no little sticker that says made in 38,500 BCE. What we can date are things that once were alive, bits of charcoal from torches or drawing sticks, bone fragments in the same layer as the art, or organic binders mixed into the pigment if we're extremely lucky. A black line on the wall might be pure manganese mineral, which is useless for radiocarbon, or it might be charcoal from a burnt branch. One is dateable, one isn't, and even when it is charcoal, there's a catch. It has to be secure. If a later visitor brought a torch into the cave 10,000 years after the original paintings, and smeared some soot over the same area, that younger carbon can contaminate the sample. If groundwater washed microscopic modern plant material into a crack next to a bison's outline, that contamination pulls the apparent age forward in time. You think you're dating the original stroke, you might be dating some much newer grime. So radiocarbon is powerful but fussy. You need carefully chosen samples, painstaking cleaning, and multiple measurements. Even then, each date comes with an error range, not 36,254 years ago, but between about 37,000 and 35,000 years ago, with a certain probability, Now move one step away from the painting and into the rock itself. This is where uranium-thorium dating comes in, especially in places like Sulawesi. Caves breathe, water slowly drips through the limestone, dissolving a little along the way, then redepositing it as thin skins of calcite over the walls and ceilings. These paper-thin crusts sometimes form on top of paintings, sealing them in like a clear coat of stone. Those crusts contain trace amounts of uranium that decay into thorium at a known rate. Measure the ratio and you can date when the calcite layer formed. Here's the crucial point that gives you a minimum age. If a hand stencil has a calcite veil dated to 39,900 years ago sitting on top of it, the hand stencil has to be at least that old. It might be older by centuries or millennia. The clock starts when the calcite forms, not when the pigment was applied. The reverse is also true. Sometimes calcite forms first, gets painted on later, and then more calcite builds on top. You can, in theory, bracket an image between a no older than date from the substrate and a no younger than date from the cover. In practice, cast systems are messy. Water flows change, crusts dissolve and reform, tiny impurities skew the uranium-thorium system. Just like radiocarbon, the numbers come with error bars and caveats. Beneath all of this, literally underfoot, is another layer of evidence. Stratigraphy. Cave floors are not empty stages. Over tens of thousands of years they build up sediments, trampled mud, ash from fires, dropped tools, broken spear points, spent torches, fallen roof fragments, animal bones, human footprints hardened into the silt. Archaeologists read these layers like pages in a book, with the usual rule, deeper is older, unless something has disturbed the sequence. If you have a floor deposit directly under a painted panel, rich with lamps, pigment grinders, and tools dated by radiocarbon to around 32,000 years ago, that gives you a context for when that wall was actively used. If later layers with different tool styles and different dates pile on top, and there's no evidence that people came back to repaint that exact panel, you can place the art within a fairly tight occupational window, even if you've never scraped a sample from the wall itself. This is indirect dating. You're not touching the painting. You're dating the environment around it. Direct dating is when you take a sliver from the pigment or the overlying calcite itself. Both approaches have strengths and weaknesses. Direct dates can be astonishingly precise, but risk damaging the art, and can be fooled by contamination. Indirect dates are gentler and safer, but always a step removed. It's like tracking the release date of a movie by analysing ticket stubs in the parking lot, instead of the film reel. Sometimes these lines of evidence disagree. A charred torch fragment in a nearby hearth might date to 27,000 years ago, while calcite over a nearby hand stencil says, at least 40,000. That doesn't necessarily mean someone made a mistake. It might mean the cave was used in multiple phases. Early artists made the stencil, nature sealed it, then much later people came back, lit fires, and never touched that particular wall. The cave isn't a single moment, it's a long, stuttering conversation. And behind all these numbers is another invisible tool, calibration. Radiocarbon years aren't the same as calendar years because the amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere has wobbled over time. Volcanic eruptions, solar activity, changes in Earth's magnetic field, all of that tweaks the baseline. If you ignore that, your dates drift. So researchers build calibration curves using things we can count precisely. Tree rings, layered lake sediments, corals, and match radiocarbon ages to real-world years. On a graph, that curve is not a smooth line. It has wiggles and plateaus. Sometimes a single radiocarbon measurement can correspond to 2 or 3 different calendar windows with similar probability. That's why you'll see ranges like 38,000 to 36,500 calibrated years ago, instead of one neat number. The science is not being sloppy, it's being honest about the noise in the system. So why does all this matter beyond trivia about half-lives and isotopes? Because where you place a painting in time changes what you think the artist's mind was like. If lion panels at Chauvet truly push back into the early Aurignacian, they become some of the earliest known figurative images anywhere. That challenges the idea that sophisticated representational art had to evolve slowly from simple marks. If a Sulawesi hunting scene is genuinely older than most European work, then narrative imagery and maybe even complex myth-making weren't a European invention. They were part of a broader human toolkit much earlier than we thought. Dating lets us connect art to tool industries, to climate swings, to known migrations. It can tell us whether a style appears suddenly or builds gradually, whether similar images on different continents could be part of the same deep tradition or must be independent inventions. But notice what it doesn't do. No matter how tight the error bars, no matter how many overlapping methods you throw at a cave wall, the numbers will never tell you what a particular bison meant to the person who painted it. They won't tell you what was whispered in the dark, or what rules governed who was allowed to come this far inside. For that, we have to go deeper into the caves themselves, into the darkness, and follow the paths those artists actually walked. Most of us hear cave art and picture a flat wall, a convenient empty space just waiting for a painting. That's not what these places are like. To reach a lot of the famous images, you don't stroll in. You crawl, squeeze, climb and commit. Take a typical limestone cave in Ice Age Europe. The entrance might be a modest opening on a cliff face or a gash in a hillside. After a few meters of daylight, the floor starts to tilt, the ceiling drops, and the light dies fast. Caves are not gently dim. They fall off a cliff from I can see to I can't see anything at all. Now imagine doing that, not with a headlamp and safety gear, but with one hand holding a stone lamp or a smoking torch, the other feeling the wall, trying not to fall into a pit you can't see. Many decorated chambers are hundreds of meters from the entrance, through tight, twisting passages. At Chauvet, some panels sit past deep shafts you could easily fall into. At Lascaux, artists worked in side galleries, so low you have to move hunched or on all fours. In Altamira, the famous bison ceiling is not near the door. It's inside a system that was once a stratified, complex space, not an open tourist tunnel. This matters because the cave isn't just a neutral gallery. It's an obstacle course. Every meter you move into the dark has a cost. Physical effort, risk of injury, the constant drain of your only light source burning down. Which brings us to lighting. You cannot paint in the dark. To work in those deep chambers, people had to bring light with them and keep it going long enough to plan, sketch, and finish. Archaeologists find small stone lamps on cave floors, little basins hollowed out of rock. They still bear residues of animal fat, likely deer, reindeer, or bison, sometimes with traces of plant fibres that may have acted as wicks. These lamps give a steady, low flame, better for working than a wildly flickering torch. Torches show up too, charcoal from burnt sticks, blackened wall patches, drip marks from resinous wood flares. Torches are excellent for moving through corridors, scanning the space, lighting up ceilings. They're terrible if you're trying to draw a precise outline that takes an hour. So what seems to have happened is a combination: torches to travel, lamps to work. All of this implies planning. You have to slaughter an animal, render or collect fat, store it, carry it in containers, fashion lamps or at least prepare suitable stones, gather dry wood or resin, and then transport all of it underground, where dropping your only light into a crack could mean not getting out. People doing this were not casually wandering in after dinner to doodle on the first rock they saw. They were organising trips, And they weren't just bringing fire. Pigment doesn't appear by magic in the deepest chambers. Red ochre has to be collected from iron-rich deposits, sometimes kilometers away. Manganese dioxide for deep blacks comes from specific mineral sources that don't always lie near caves. Charcoal for black lines needs to be produced, cooled and kept dry. Then you need tools to grind it: stone mortars, pestles, grinding slabs, and maybe binders, water, animal fat, plant juices, blood spit. Some pigments were used as dry powders blown through hollow bones to make stencils. Others were mixed into pastes for brushing or finger painting. When you find grindstones, pigment lumps, broken lamps, and discarded torches all clustered under a particular panel, you're looking at a small logistics hub. These chambers were workshops as much as sanctuaries. Again, this points away from someone absent-mindedly drew a horse while taking shelter from the rain, and towards something scheduled, prepared, repeatable. People planned to go in, they assembled supplies, they moved in groups, for safety, for carrying capacity, maybe for ritual reasons. Deep cave art is the visible tip of an invisible supply chain. The cave itself shapes what they could do and what survives. Caves are humid. Temperatures hover near the local annual average and barely fluctuate. Air can be still or drafty depending on hidden openings. Surfaces vary wildly: rough, crumbly rock that eats pigment, smooth, damp calcite that takes it brilliantly, bulging protrusions that can be turned into the shoulders of a bison or the swell of a lion's chest. Artists clearly chose and exploited these features. They weren't looking for blank canvases, they were looking for opportunities in the rock. Some areas echo, clap, or shout, and certain chambers respond with focused reflections, low rumbles, or eerie resonances. Studies in multiple caves show a correlation between strong acoustic effects and decorated zones. Not every echoing bit of cave is painted, but many painted panels sit where the sound changes, near constrictions, domes, or junctions of passages. It's not proof of a sound ritual, but it hints that people were experiencing these places with more than their eyes. Humidity and stable temperatures are part of why these paintings last tens of thousands of years. Outside, rain, frost, and sun would have destroyed charcoal sketches in years. Deep inside, away from wind and UV light, pigments can cling to the same calcite for millennia, unless disturbed by dripping water or rockfall. The places that preserve art best are also the places farthest from casual access. And that raises a social question: who got to go there? If entering a cave requires knowledge of the route, mastery of fire, and a willingness to accept real danger, access is not trivial. You can't bring a whole camp of children and elders into a twisting cavern with hidden pits. You probably don't want a crowded, jostling line of people when one bad step could extinguish the only lamp. This suggests some level of control, whether formal or informal, over who went how far and when. Maybe only certain individuals, trained or initiated, led the way. Maybe specific seasons or events triggered deep incursions, midwinter gatherings, funerary rites, initiation ceremonies, or planning sessions for big hunts. We don't know the rules, but it's hard to imagine there were none. Even simple practicalities create gatekeeping. Fat and torches are costly in a world where every calorie matters. Time spent underground is time not spent hunting, gathering, or tending fires up top. The choice to allocate resources to deep cave visits means someone decided that what happened in there justified the expense. So when we look at a horse panel 600 meters from daylight, we're not just seeing an image. We're seeing the end point of a journey that had to be organized, supplied, and socially sanctioned. The darkness isn't a backdrop, it's part of the meaning. Only after we grasp that cost, the geography, the hazards, the logistics, does it make sense to zoom in and ask how exactly those images were engineered onto stone. Once you're down there, with your little pool of lamplight and a wall of stone, the next question is obvious. How do you actually make an image that lasts 40,000 years? Start with colour. The Ice Age palette is surprisingly limited and incredibly effective. Reds and yellows mostly come from ochres, iron-rich clays and earths. Blacks come from two main sources, charcoal and manganese oxides. Whites are usually the natural rock surface, or scraped, pale calcite. None of these arrive ready to use. You have to find them. Ochre doesn't glow red on a hillside like cartoon treasure. It appears as streaks, nodules, crumbly seams in certain rocks and soils. Manganese oxides form in specific geological settings, often as dark, heavy chunks mixed with other minerals. Someone had to know where those deposits were, go there on purpose, and carry the raw material back. Then comes processing. Pigment nodules are hard. To turn them into something you can paint with, you grind and grind against a flat stone, in a little hollowed-out cup, with hammerstones and pestles. Archaeologists have found these grindstones stained deep red or black, sometimes in layers from repeated use. The powder is then mixed with water for a thin wash, with fat or marrow for a richer, more durable paste, with spit if you're improvising. Charcoal is different. You make it usually by charring wood in low oxygen, embers buried under ash or logs left at the edge of a dying fire. Once cooled, the brittle black sticks can be used directly as drawing tools or crushed for paint. Charcoal lines are silky, precise, easy to erase or rework with a thumb. Manganese blacks, by contrast, give dense, stubborn marks that bite into the stone. So, by the time someone lifts a hand to the wall, there's already a chain of decisions. Where to source pigment, how fine to grind it, what to mix it with. Every horse or bison you see is the end point of that chemistry. Now look at how they actually put it on. The simplest tool is the body itself. Fingers dragged through soft pigment leaf smears, stripes, outlines. Some panels are entirely finger-painted, broad, gestural marks, with fingertip ridges still visible. Other marks were probably made with pads, lumps of fur or moss or leather dabbed in pigment, and pressed or wiped across the surface, like a prehistoric sponge. Then there are brushes. We don't have the bristles, but we see the strokes, fine, hair-thin lines, delicate hatching, edges where the pigment tapers the way it does with a flexible tip. A brush doesn't appear by accident. You have to strip and bundle plant fibres, or chew and fray a twig, or cut and tie animal hair. That's tool-making in the service of image-making. And then there's one of the cleverest tricks, blowpipes. Hand stencils and some shaded areas show the signature of pigment sprayed rather than painted. The edges are soft and speckled, with tiny droplets radiating out from a source point. Experiments match this to pigment blown from the mouth, often through a hollow bird bone or reed. You hold your hand against the wall, load the pipe with dry or slightly damp powder, and blow. The pigment hits the rock wherever your hand isn't, creating a negative silhouette. This is technical and symbolic at the same time. Technically, it's a way to cover uneven surfaces quickly and evenly. Symbolically, it's your physical presence recorded as absence, a ghost of your hand, outlined by the breath that carried pigment from your lungs to the stone. Not all marks are additive. Some are subtractive. Engraving, cutting into the rock with a sharp stone tool, produces incised outlines, cross-hatching, fur textures, manes, and sometimes entire figures. Scraping removes surface deposits of darker crust to reveal pale rock beneath, producing high-contrast designs. In many caves, artists combine both, first carving a contour, then rubbing pigment into the groove so the line reads dark and sharp even in low light. All of this happens on a surface that is anything but flat. One of the most striking things about these images is how they use the rock's natural relief. A bulging protrusion becomes the shoulder of an aurochs pushing toward you. A depression becomes the hollow of a flank. A narrow, curved ridge suggests a neck in motion. Artists position animals so that a bison's hump follows a swell in the rock, or a mammoth's head wraps around a curve. This is not random. You can trace cases where the same fissure is turned into a spine across multiple overlapping animals, or where two different species share a single bulge, one using it as a chest, another as a haunch. It's 3D thinking, seeing a raw, chaotic surface and mentally rotating it until it aligns with a creature in your head. Under a moving lamp, this has a powerful effect. Shadows slip across bumps and hollows, making the painted lines seem to shift. A horse looks like it's stepping out of the wall. A lion looks like it's about to move. Some panels exaggerate this, stacking multiple outlines of heads or legs along a curve, so that as your light moves, one contour brightens while another falls into shadow. It's proto-animation engineered out of rock, pigment and firelight. We also see evidence that these images weren't always one and done. Layering is everywhere. A dark horse painted over a faint red one. A bison's horns corrected with a new line. A mammoth partially obscured by later signs. Sometimes this is simple reuse of a good spot by later visitors, but sometimes the same style and pigment suggest near contemporary reworking. There are ghost lines, sketchy first attempts abandoned in favour of a cleaner outline slightly to one side. There are erased areas where scraping or rubbing has removed earlier marks to make room for new ones. In a few cases, thick pigment layers and microscopic analysis show repeated repainting of the same figure over time, as if maintaining it, refreshing it, keeping it alive. All of that implies planning, evaluation, and correction. Someone looked at a line and decided it was wrong, then fixed it. Someone came back years or generations later and chose to renew a specific bison but ignore another nearby. These caves are not static murals, they're palimpsests. Hand stencils tie many of these techniques together. They're technically sophisticated, choosing the right concentration of pigment so it doesn't run, controlling breath, adjusting distance so the edges are crisp. Some caves show layered stencils one hand over another, sometimes in different colours, sometimes rotated. Others have partial hands, with missing fingers that might reflect gestures, injuries, frostbite, or ritual modification. We don't know. But even if we strip away every symbolic guess and treat them purely as technique, they're impressive. A negative hand uses rock, air, pigment, and body in one coordinated action. It's an image of presence created by absence, a record of a moment that took planning to execute. And yet, technical mastery doesn't tell us what any of this meant. You can be brilliant at mixing pigment and still be painting for reasons utterly unlike ours. The fact that someone understood how to exploit perspective on a curved wall doesn't automatically mean they thought in terms of art, realism, or aesthetic achievement in any modern sense. It just means they were very good at getting a particular visual effect that, in their world, served some purpose, practical, ritual, mnemonic, social, or all of the above. So as we move forward into the animal catalogue, the apparent motion, the strange signs, we have to hold two ideas at once. These people were technically sophisticated image engineers, perfectly capable of complex planning and refined execution. But their mastery of materials and techniques is the starting point for understanding the caves, not the conclusion about what they were trying to record. Step back from the brushwork and the clever use of rock. Look at what they chose to spend all that effort on. It's not a random zoo over and over in caves separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years. You see the same core cast: bison, wild horses, massive cattle called aurochs, various kinds of deer, mammoths and woolly rhinoceros in some regions. In a few caves, there are big cats, bears, ibex, sometimes birds or fish. But those are rare cameos. The main panels are dominated by large herbivores. And that's already a puzzle, because when archaeologists sift through the bones in nearby living sites, actual camp debris, hearth dumps, kill sites, the menu doesn't always match the art. In some regions, people were eating a lot of reindeer, small game and fish, but painting mostly horses and bison. In others, mammoth imagery is everywhere on the walls, but mammoth bones are scarce in the food remains. So, if the cave is just a hunting diary, it's a strangely biased one. This is where people start making lists. You can treat the walls like a catalogue. Count how many of each species appear, map where they show up, compare that to the known Ice Age fauna in the region. Sometimes the match is excellent. The animals painted in, say the Dordogne, fit neatly with what we know roamed that landscape during the period when the pigments date. They're not inventing fantasy beasts, they're depicting real species that shared their world. But the catalogue is selective. Some very common animals are barely represented. Small game, rabbits, hares, birds are almost absent. Reindeer, a major food source in many places, are underrepresented compared to how many bones we find. And humans? Human figures are vanishingly rare, and when they appear, they're often distorted, masked, or part animal. So the first thing the animal catalogue tells us is, not here is everything that existed, but here are the creatures that were worth taking underground. That selectivity becomes even more interesting when you look at how those animals are drawn. Ice Age artists could be incredibly precise. On some horses you can count ribs. On bison, the angle of the hump, the curvature of the horns, the line where the fur changes length. These match specific species and even sex and age classes that zoologists can identify. You can tell a steppe bison from a modern bison by the profile of the skull, and the cave outlines get that right. It's tempting to say such accuracy must mean scientific observation, a kind of field guide on stone. Maybe, but accuracy alone doesn't tell you the purpose. A medieval religious icon can have perfect anatomical drapery and still not be a biology lesson. Skill is a tool you can aim at many different targets. What accuracy does tell us is that these people were watching closely. They weren't just sketching generic deer-shaped thing. They knew what a pregnant mare's belly looks like from the side, how a bison's fur clumps in winter versus summer, how an aurochs lowers its head and twists when it's about to charge. Those differences show up on the walls, and that is where behaviour creeps in. In several caves, you don't just get single animals standing in profile. You get groups moving in the same direction, overlapping bodies that suggest a herd in motion. You see males with swollen necks or lowered heads that look like rutting behaviour, breeding season postures. You see females with distended bellies, udders, or young close at flank. Some panels seem to cluster certain life stages together. Many pregnant horses in one area, many young bison in another. If you lived in a world where your survival depended on tracking migratory herds and seasonal cycles, these details matter. Knowing when horses are likely to foal, when bison are at their fattest, when rut-crazed males are dangerous or easiest to approach, this is calendar knowledge. So one line of thinking is that these panels are not just animals but time markers. A wall dominated by rutting deer might index autumn. A cluster of heavily pregnant mares might signal late winter or early spring. A sequence of different animals in different conditions could lay out a mental year, when each species does what and where. Does that mean the caves are straightforward almanacs? Probably not, but it suggests that behavioural detail is a potential seasonal clue, and that some viewers at the time would have read these bodies not just as bison, but as bison in this particular phase of their yearly cycle. Predators complicate the picture. When lions, bears, wolves show up, they often do so differently from the big plant eaters. They may appear more isolated, smaller in number, sometimes in more remote or hard-to-access parts of the cave. Lions in particular are often shown in tense, stalking poses, heads low, eyes forward, in lines that feel less like meat source and more like danger, power, presence. In some caves, predators are placed near entrances or thresholds between chambers, almost like guardians. In others, they're tucked into niches you have to seek out. Prey animals fill broad panels, predators haunt corners. Again, that's not universal, but it's a pattern strong enough that researchers take it seriously. One interpretation is straightforward ecology. Herbivores are central because they're central to human life. Food, hides, bone, sinew, while predators are peripheral because they're rarer, more fearsome, less economically important. Another sees a symbolic hierarchy. Prey as the main business of life, predators as special beings, dangerous others, spirit animals, totem figures or rivals. Either way, their different treatment suggests that all animals are not equal in the logic of these caves. This brings us to a constant argument. Are we looking at a mirror of the local ecology, or at a symbolic selection that might ignore what was actually most common outside? If you only had the art, you might think certain regions were overrun with bison and almost empty of reindeer. The bones tell a different story. That tension is valuable. It tells us that the choice of species is not simply what we see most often outside, but what we choose to represent when we go to the trouble of painting underground. Why paint what you don't eat isn't a gotcha question. It's a clue. It suggests that the function of these images goes beyond a simple grocery list. Maybe certain animals carried mythic weight, ancestors, spirit guides, clan emblems. Maybe they were tied to particular places, a horse valley, a bison plain, a mammoth crossing, painted as a way of mapping territory in memory rather than on paper. Maybe some species signaled times of year, others social events like mass hunts or gatherings. We can't pin it down to a single answer, but we can say this: the animal catalogue is curated. What's there? What's rare? What's missing? How carefully bodies are rendered? Which behaviours are frozen in pigment? All of this suggests that Ice Age people were using animals as more than decoration. They were thinking with them about time, about risk, about abundance, about identity. And when those animals start to multiply, overlap, and move across the walls, the catalogue becomes something stranger. It begins to look less like a static list, and more like snapshots from a moving world, a world they were trying to capture not just in space, but in time. If you stare at a single animal long enough, it's easy to forget that these weren't meant to be seen as isolated portraits. Step back again. Let your eye follow a bison from head to tail, then let it drift to the next one, and the next. In some panels, you suddenly realize you're looking at a kind of visual stutter, extra legs, doubled heads, outlines that don't quite line up. At first glance, it can look like a mess, like somebody couldn't decide where to put the body and just kept redrawing. But when researchers trace the lines carefully, you start to see a different pattern. Extra limbs aren't random. They're often offset just enough to suggest different phases of a stride. A horse with 8 legs isn't a mutant. It's a horse mid-gallop, each pair of legs marking a different position in the running cycle. A bison with two heads at slightly different angles can be read as one animal tossing its head, turning from one direction to another. On flat paper we'd call this motion blur. On cave walls, overlapping outlines and multiple body parts appear to be a way of doing something we take for granted in animation and photography, trying to pin movement to a still surface. In some cases, the artists separated the poses instead of stacking them. You get sequences, a line of animals, not identical, but each a little different. One lowers its head, the next steps forward, the next turns, the last one seems to veer away. On their own, each could be read as a separate animal. In series, they look suspiciously like frames. This is where the proto-animation idea comes in. People have suggested that if you walked along the wall with a flickering torch, the light would pick out different parts of these overlapping images in quick succession. Your brain, wired to find patterns in chaos, might stitch those glimpses together into movement. A herd surging forward, a horse bolting, a bison twisting to charge. Add in the irregular surface of the cave, the bulges and dips that were consciously used to swell a bison's haunch or hollow out a horse's flank, and you get another layer. As the torch moves, shadows shift across these three-dimensional forms. A swelling in the rock makes a painted belly seem to rise. A ridge turns a static neck into a moving one. Some archaeologists think this was deliberate, that the cave itself was part of the effect, the original motion platform. Others are more cautious. Yes, torchlight flickers and shadows move. Yes, that can create a sense of animation. But did the painters intend it, or are we projecting our cinematic habits backward? We can't test it with the original viewers. We can only note that the conditions are there, repeated outlines that line up like frames, surfaces chosen for their volume, a viewing environment defined by unsteady light. What we can say more safely is that many of these images are not just about what animals look like, but what animals do. Take charging. A standing bison and a bison about to hit you don't share the same geometry. The back drops, the head lowers, the neck thickens, the legs brace. Those different states show up, sometimes layered on the same individual. Similarly, horses mid-run tuck their legs differently than when they're just walking. Some cave horses show those tucked flying postures we recognize from high-speed photography. Turning is another favourite. Many outlines capture that awkward, beautiful twist of the body as an animal wheels around. Shoulders already rotated, hindquarters still catching up. You see necks craned, tails at an angle, hooves planted in ways that only make sense if the animal is pivoting. And then there's interaction. In a few panels, animals clearly relate to one another in ways that go beyond standing near. Predators stalk lines of prey. Bison seem to converge on a fallen or crouched figure. Horses cluster face to tail in the tight formations you get when a herd is compressed or wary. Sometimes a single species is shown in multiple postures across the same wall, calm, alert, fleeing. Put all that together, and time starts creeping in as a subject. Maybe each overlapping outline is a single moment, frozen. Maybe a sequence across a panel is a short unfolding, before, during, after, or maybe the panels stretch further, encoding longer cycles. Charging males might signal rut season, graceful running herds the migrations to and from winter grounds. A cave wall could hold a compressed year, or many years of remembered events, all mapped in animal postures. This doesn't have to mean story in the Hollywood sense. You don't need a beginning, middle, and end to think in terms of this happens, then that. A cluster of scenes, heard at rest, heard in motion, heard under threat, could function as a mental toolkit for understanding recurring patterns, how animals behave when they're spooked, when they're about to bolt, when they're safe to approach. Some researchers lean into the narrative angle. They see in these panels the earliest comics, sequential images meant to be read in order, telling stories of hunts, encounters, maybe myths. Others argue for a looser interpretation, not strict sequences, but associative clusters, a kind of visual grammar of states and actions that a trained viewer would know how to unpack. Either way, the attempt to capture motion implies two big things. First, observation. You don't invent these poses from imagination alone. You only get the angle of a turning neck or the exact stretch of a running stride if you've watched it happen many times and held those tiny slices of movement in mind. That takes attention, it takes memory. It suggests people, maybe whole groups, spending serious time just watching animals move and comparing what they see. Second, intention. Overlapping the wrong lines makes a tangle. Overlapping the right ones creates a rhythm your eyes can follow. Choosing which moments to stack, which to separate, which surfaces to use, how to space bodies on a panel, all that implies planning. These aren't casual doodles. Someone thought about how an image would unfold in a dark, moving environment in front of eyes that already knew these animals intimately. We can't prove that Ice Age people invented animation in the way we understand it. We can't rewind the torchlight and see the walls through their nervous systems. But when you look closely at the multiples, the blurred limbs, the turning bodies, it's hard to escape the sense that they were wrestling with the same problem filmmakers face now. How do you trap time in a still image? How do you make rock remember motion? And just when you start to see the animals move, something else appears in the flicker. Shapes that are neither bison, nor horse, nor mammoth. Lines that look like hands, fingers, human traces layered into the same dark corridors where the herds run across the stone. Follow those human traces far enough, and the cave starts to feel less like an animal world and more like a place where people insisted on being present. The most obvious sign is also the strangest. Open hands, not drawn but implied, appear as silhouettes on the walls. The outline is crisp, the interior is the bare rock, and the space around is misted in red or black pigment. To make one of these, you press your hand flat against the stone and blow paint over it, through your mouth, through a hollow bone, through a reed, so that when you pull away, the negative shape of your hand remains. These hand stencils show up from Spain to Indonesia, from France to Sulawesi, separated by tens of thousands of years and entire continents. Different pigments, different styles, same basic gesture, hand to wall, breath to pigment, outline fixed. What did that mean to the person doing it? On one level, it's participation. You might not be the one drawing the massive aurochs or carefully engraving the horses, but you can still leave a mark. A wall filled with stenciled hands starts to look like a roll call. I was here. I came into the dark with you. Some researchers see them as identity marks, a kind of prehistoric profile picture. We can sometimes pick out repeated hands, same proportions, same missing finger joint, appearing in different parts of the cave. That suggests specific individuals moving through, adding their presence in multiple places, maybe across multiple visits. Others lean toward protection and ritual. An open hand is a powerful symbol in many later cultures, warding off danger, invoking help, signaling oath or belonging. Pressing your living hand to cold rock, then wrapping it in a mist of red, the colour of blood, of life, could feel like armouring yourself or binding yourself to whatever power the cave held. But these aren't the only traces of human contact. In some caves, especially where the walls are coated in a thin layer of soft clay or calcite, you get something even more direct, finger flutings. Imagine a child dragging their fingers through fresh mud, leaving parallel grooves. Now move that scene into the deep dark of a cave ceiling, 10, 20, 50 meters from the entrance. Lines curve, loop, zigzag, overlap. Sometimes they form loose ladders or nested arcs. Sometimes they follow the bulges and hollows of the rock so closely that it's hard to tell where stone shape ends and human gesture begins. These flutings can look random at first glance, but careful analysis shows patterns. Certain sets of lines repeat, certain directions are favoured. Some are made with 3 fingers, some with 4, some with the whole hand splayed. In a few cases you can see where someone switched hands mid-stroke, or where multiple people took turns on the same patch of wall, their tracks interweaving. If paintings feel like planned images, flutings feel like movement recorded directly. You can almost reconstruct the body that made them. Someone standing here, reaching up there, stretching, pivoting, maybe even climbing onto a rock to get a better angle. The wall becomes a record of choreography, of how people's arms and shoulders moved in this constrained space. This is where the question of who exactly did this starts to matter. Anthropologists have tried to estimate the sex and age of the stencil makers by measuring hand size, finger length ratios, palm widths. Some studies have argued that a surprising number of hands belong to women. Others suggest a mix: adult men, adult women, adolescents, children. But these methods are controversial. Modern population averages don't necessarily map neatly onto Ice Age bodies. Nutritional differences, genetic differences, and tiny sample sizes can all distort the numbers. The same goes for flutings, where groove spacing has been used to argue for small children as active participants, but again, the data are thin and the margins of error are big. Still, one line of evidence is hard to shake. Some hands and some flutings are very small. Too small to belong to full-grown adults, even allowing for ancient variation. In Ruffignac in France, for example, finger flutings high on a ceiling have been traced back to children as young as 5 or 6, based on reach and finger spacing. Their tracks run right alongside those of adults. If that's right, it means children were being brought deep into these caves. Not just to watch from a safe distance at the entrance, but to participate, pressing their hands to the wall, dragging their fingers through clay, helping to transform the cave into a humanized space. That has huge implications. It suggests that whatever was happening down there wasn't reserved for a secretive elite of adult ritual specialists. It involved families, or at least multiple generations. Knowledge of the cave, of its images and its dangers and its meanings, may have been part of growing up, something learned with your body, not just with your ears. It also reframes the act of touching the wall. We tend to focus on the animal images as the central content, and the hands and flutings as peripheral, like signatures in the margins. But it might be the other way around. Touching, tracing, leaving marks with your own skin could have been the core experience. The paintings might sit inside that broader practice rather than above it. Think about what touch does that sight doesn't. When you push your hand against rock, you feel temperature, texture, sometimes even the faint vibration of your own pulse against something unimaginably old. When you drag your fingers through soft clay, you feel resistance and flow. Your nervous system gets a continuous feedback loop of I move, the world responds. For people living in a world where spirits, animals, ancestors and landscapes all blur together, that feedback could easily feel like contact, like a conversation. So how do we interpret these human traces? One idea is the signature hypothesis. Each hand stencil is basically me, here, an individual tag that fits with the repetition of certain hands and the clustering of stencils in entrance areas where lots of people could see them. Another is the ritual trace hypothesis. In this view, the act of making the mark matters more than who made which one. Maybe everyone in a group was expected to leave their hand as part of a ceremony. Maybe fluting a particular panel was part of a journey or initiation. touching specific surfaces in a prescribed order, layering gesture on gesture until the rock held the memory of the rite. And then there's the play hypothesis, especially for children. Dragging fingers through soft surfaces and watching patterns appear is inherently fun. Some flutings might be nothing more than boredom relief while adults did more serious work nearby. These don't cancel each other out. The same behaviour, blowing pigment over a hand, running fingers through clay, can be playful for a child, solemn for an adult, deeply symbolic for someone steeped in group myth. Modern rituals work this way too. A child might splash in holy water because it's cool, while an elder crosses themselves with full awareness of its meaning. The motion is identical, the experience is layered. In the caves, those layers accumulate in the same narrow spaces. A ceiling covered in flutings could be read as a playground, as a ritual text, as a map of who belonged. A wall of hands could be a guest book, a protective curtain, a lineage. What's striking is that, in all these possibilities, the human body is both the tool and the message. No brush, no chisel, no intermediary, just skin, breath, and stone meeting in the dark. We look at the animals and see observation, hunting knowledge, ecological memory. With the hands and flutings we see something else rising alongside that, people turning their own presence into a thing that can be stored, revisited, maybe even reread. And just beyond the hands, surrounding them, sometimes interlaced with them, another layer appears, marks that are neither animal nor human outline. Dots, lines, ladders, strange key-shaped forms that repeat across caves and continents, as if some shared visual vocabulary was being built on top of all this touch. Once you start looking for them, those marks are everywhere. Between the bison and horses, above the hands, tucked into corners that otherwise seem empty, you find small, repeated shapes. A row of dots, a series of short dashes, a little ladder, a branching line, a shape like a key or a club, or a distorted letter, P. Archaeologists call these non-figurative signs, which is a polite way of saying we have no idea what they mean, but they don't look like animals. The inventory is surprisingly consistent. You get simple dots and short bars, sometimes arranged in lines, sometimes in clusters. You get chevrons, little V-shapes, either alone or chained together. There are open rectangles, grids and ladder-like forms with two parallel lines linked by crossbars. There are crescents and arcs, sometimes hugging the contours of an animal's back or horn. And then there are the strange ones, claviforms, the key shapes. A thicker bulb or knob at one end, tapering into a shaft or tail. They're not obviously tools or animals, but versions of them pop up again and again, especially in caves like Lascaux, Neo and others in southwestern France. When researchers started systematically cataloguing these signs across Europe, a pattern emerged. Out of the many possible ways a human could scratch or paint on rock, Upper Paleolithic people seem to have favoured a limited set of motifs. One team counted just a few dozen recurring sign types shared across more than 200 sites, spanning tens of thousands of years. That's weird. It suggests we're not just looking at idle doodling. If every person was inventing their own marks on the fly, we'd expect chaos, endless variation, no stable types. But instead we see repetition. Certain signs appear in cave after cave. Some are strongly associated with particular regions, others are almost pan-European. A handful endure for millennia. This is what makes some archaeologists talk about conventions. Not writing, not an alphabet, but a shared visual vocabulary, patterns that people recognized and reproduced, the way we might recognize a heart shape as love or a skull and crossbones as danger, even if no letters are involved. At this point, the temptation to call it a code is almost irresistible. You have repeated symbols, arranged in sequences associated with animals, sometimes clustered in key locations. You have a society that clearly cared about transmitting knowledge. It's easy to leap to this is proto-writing, the dots are numbers. The lines are months, the claviforms are something technical we just haven't cracked yet. There are even recent claims along these lines. Some researchers argue that certain dot sequences next to animals might record mating seasons or migratory timing, essentially early calendars. Others suggest tallies of kills or notches representing members of a group. Maybe. But this is where the danger lies. Humans are pattern-seeking machines. Put us in front of ambiguous marks, and we will happily hallucinate meaning. We see faces in clouds, constellations in random star fields, secret messages in noise. The risk with these cave signs is that we're doing the same thing, projecting the kinds of record-keeping we're familiar with, numbers, calendars, lists, onto marks that might have lived in a completely different mental world. There's also a big gap between repeated sign and fully developed code. Writing systems have rules. The marks combine in consistent ways. They map onto language or numbers in repeatable patterns. With the cave signs, the evidence is murkier. The same sign can appear alone, next to different animals, in different positions, with no obvious ordering. So what else could they be? One possibility is that many of these signs are about identity and territory. Think of them as clan emblems, group badges, or markers of "this place is us." A certain combination of dots and lines might be the mark of a particular band that regularly used that cave. A claviform might signal a ritual association, a totemic animal, or a mythic ancestor. Another option is counting, but not in the way we think of a spreadsheet. Tallies can be rough. Some, many, enough. A string of marks might record visits to the cave, successful hunts, phases of a ceremony, the number of participants in a rite. You don't need a full numeral system to make that meaningful. You just need everyone in your group to agree what the strokes stand for. Then there's pure symbolism, signs that point to stories, beings, or concepts. A chevron might not be a V, it might be the path, or the opening, or some mythic creature's track. A ladder could be the between worlds or the ascent. In many later cultures, abstract patterns, crosses, spirals, zigzags, carry thick bundles of meaning that aren't reducible to numbers at all. Cross-site comparisons make it clear that whatever was going on, it wasn't uniform. The same sign in two different caves might belong to two different dialects of meaning. Standardization might not mean same word everywhere, but rather same kind of tool. Think of how we use arrows. On a road sign, an arrow means go this way. In a flowchart, it means this leads to that. In an online comment, it can mean I agree with this. The form is standardized. The function shifts with context. The Paleolithic signs might work like that. Stable shapes doing different jobs in different narrative or ritual settings. So how do we judge the bold claims that someone has finally decoded the marks? A few sober criteria help. First, consistency. Does the proposed meaning hold across many caves, many dates, many contexts, or is it cherry-picked from a handful of convenient examples? Second, predictiveness. Can the theory correctly anticipate where certain signs should appear, or what combinations we'll find in newly studied sites? Third, independence. Does it align with other lines of evidence, seasonal patterns in animal bones, environmental data, ethnographic parallels, without simply bending them to fit? If someone argues that a set of dots records breeding seasons, we'd want to see those dots consistently associated with animals whose bones show seasonal hunting patterns, not scattered at random. If a sign is claimed to mark a particular group, we might expect it to cluster in caves within that group's likely territory, and to be absent elsewhere. So far, no hypothesis clears all those bars. Some are intriguing, some fit local patterns nicely. But we're not yet at the stage where we can read the walls the way we read a text. That uncertainty doesn't make the signs less important. If anything, it makes them more revealing. They sit on the boundary between image and inscription, between picture and notation. They show that people were not only watching animals and touching rock, they were also inventing compact, repeatable marks that could travel from mind to mind. Whether those marks were counting kills, tagging territory, invoking spirits, or gesturing at stories we'll never fully reconstruct, they tell us this much. Ice Age humans weren't just representing the world. They were beginning to compress it, to encode it in shapes that could outlast memory. And once you can do that, once you start packing meaning into repeated signs, it's only a small step to arranging those signs into scenes where relationships and events begin to unfold right on the stone. Once you start looking for scenes, you realize how rare they actually are. Most of the time, the walls give you single animals, maybe overlapping herds, plus those abstract signs drifting around them like punctuation you can't read. But every so often, in a handful of caves scattered across thousands of miles and thousands of years, something different happens. Images line up, bodies face each other, limbs intersect in ways that don't look accidental. You get situations, and this is where everything gets tricky. Because the moment you see two figures interacting, your storytelling brain kicks in. You don't just see lines and shapes anymore. You see before and after. You see causes and consequences. You see a narrative. Archaeologists argue about this constantly. When is a scene really a scene, and when is it just coincidence of placement? Take a classic example. An animal apparently pierced by spears with a human-like figure nearby. That looks like a hunt, right? A textbook illustration of, we killed this thing, maybe. But slow down. First question, are those spears really spears? Sometimes they're just lines that happen to cross a body. Sometimes they were added thousands of years later by someone with a different style, different intentions. Pigment analysis and superposition studies often show that what looks like a single composition is actually a stack of different episodes. Bison from one period, signs from another, a scratch from a bored visitor 10,000 years afterward. So archaeologists work scene by scene, almost like detectives. Does the paint match? Do the outlines share the same technique, the same mineral source, the same micro-cracking pattern? Are the edges smoothed in a similar way by centuries of condensation? If multiple elements were clearly made at the same time, with consistent technique, that's our first hint. We're looking at an intentional composition. Then comes the harder question. Interaction. If one animal is biting another, are the jaws actually drawn over the other neck with careful alignment, or do they just happen to overlap because the wall was crowded? If a human figure stands below a wounded bull, is the posture clearly related, arms extended towards it, same ground line, or is the person floating in space like a sticker slapped on later? You can see why people fight about this. Our brains want stories. The rocks give us fragments. Human figures make the temptation even stronger, and they are almost shockingly scarce. Across thousands of animal images, full human bodies are rare. When they do appear, they're often simplified. Stick-like limbs, triangular torsos, masks instead of faces, sometimes strange genital exaggerations. They look less like portraits and more like types or roles. This scarcity might be practical. Animals mattered more to survival. But many researchers suspect taboos or conventions. Maybe you didn't casually paint people in sacred spaces. Maybe depicting a recognizable individual was dangerous or socially forbidden. Many later traditional societies treat human likenesses as powerful, risky things. It's not a stretch to imagine Ice Age people had similar ideas. So instead we get this odd compromise: humans as simplified, anonymous bodies, or humans merged with something else. Those merged figures are some of the strangest images in all of prehistory. Bodies with animal heads, human legs and a tail, bird-like faces on otherwise human torsos, composite beings that seem to hover between categories. Here again, interpretations split. One camp sees myth, culture heroes, spirits, deities, ancestors in animal guise. Another sees ritual specialists, shamans, wearing masks and skin cloaks, captured mid-performance. A third points out that in flickering torchlight, with surfaces bulging and cracking, your visual system is primed to misperceive. Maybe those hybrids are partly accidents of rock and shadow, completed by our pattern-hungry brains. Whatever the cause, the effect is powerful. A human bison or human bird is already a tiny story, two things fused into one, a relationship made permanent. Put that composite figure into a complex panel, surrounded by animals, signs, strange postures, and you have a scene that begs for a plot. This is where narrative hypotheses proliferate. Maybe some scenes were teaching tools. A panel might compress the steps of a hunt into one tableau. The herd, the injured animal, the fallen hunter, the powerful spirit overseeing it all. You don't need animation to explain this is what can happen if you grow up listening to stories in that chamber. Others could be memory aids like a mnemonic diagram for an oral tale. The composite being stands for a character. The animals mark key episodes. The dots and signs slot in as beats, journeys, seasons, rules. If you know the story, the wall is a prompt, a skeleton to hang words on. Some scenes look like they want to be origin stories or moral warnings. A human struck down beneath a dominating animal, a wounded figure near a dangerous beast. Later mythologies are full of tales explaining why a species behaves a certain way, or why humans must respect particular boundaries. It's easy to imagine the same kind of narrative logic operating here. This is what happened when someone broke the rule. This is how we learned to treat this animal. But here's the hard limit. We don't have the accompanying voices. All of this art existed inside dense oral traditions. Songs, recitations, initiation speeches, whispered warnings in the dark. The images were never meant to stand alone. They were anchors for words, gestures, smells, sounds, experiences we can only guess at. Without that oral layer, our readings are always provisional. We can say this looks like interaction. This cluster probably belongs to one creative act. This figure is clearly not just a horse. We can even test some ideas against bones, seasons, and ethnographic parallels. But the plot, the exact who did what to whom and why it matters, is mostly out of reach. That doesn't make the scenes less important. It makes them more haunting. They show that Ice Age people weren't just cataloguing animals or tagging walls with abstract signs. Sometimes in rare bursts of concentrated meaning they arranged beings into relationships. They froze interactions that almost certainly mapped onto stories everybody there knew. For us, those stories are gone. What remains are the frames, enigmatic, fragmentary, and just coherent enough that, 40,000 years later, we still find ourselves leaning in, trying to finish the tale. If you show that same scene panel to an early 20th century archaeologist, they don't hesitate. Spears, wounded animal, human figure, that's hunting magic. This idea dominated explanations of cave art for decades. The basic story goes like this. If your life depends on killing enormous, dangerous animals with stone points and wooden spears, you're going to do everything you can to tilt the odds. One way is practical skill, another is supernatural leverage. So you paint the prey. You wound it symbolically, piercing it with arrows of pigment. You perform rituals in front of the wall, chant over it, touch the painted wound with real spears. By harming the animal's image, you somehow weaken the real creature, or persuade the spirits that govern game to release more bodies into your path. It's a neat theory. It explains the focus on large mammals, the occasional wounded figures, the apparent repetition of the important species deep in the cave. It echoes beliefs documented in more recent traditional hunting societies, where people talk about releasing the spirit of the animal, asking its permission or calling herds. The problem is, once people really started cataloguing the art, the ice began to crack under pure hunting magic. Many of the most frequently painted animals, horses for example, don't show up in proportionally huge numbers in the bones at nearby sites. Species that were actually eaten in bulk, like reindeer or smaller game, can be underrepresented on the walls. And a surprising number of animal images show no obvious wounds, no spears, no clear connection to killing at all. Even more awkward, some of the most dangerous animals, lions, rhinos, big bears, are abundant in the paintings, but they barely appear in the trash heaps. People weren't eating them, they may have been mostly trying to avoid them. So if this is hunting magic, it's a very strange kind, focused on animals you don't kill much, in places you rarely go, with symbols we can't decode. That's why many researchers today prefer to talk about hunting knowledge instead. Look again at those walls with that lens, and something else comes into focus. You don't just see bison, you see bison in rut posture, head low, mane flared, tail lifted. You see pregnant horses, swollen bellies and careful attention to the curve of the flank. You see ibex with seasonally specific horn growth. You see clues about herd behavior, age, sex, stress. In other words, ethology, field notes, a visual database of how animals move, when they're where, what they do right before they're vulnerable, and right before they're dangerous. Panels often mix species that actually share habitats or migration corridors. In some caves, particular chambers are dominated by animals associated with a given type of landscape, river crossings, cliffs, open plains. It's not crazy to imagine that to someone trained in that system. A wall full of certain species might read as, "This is the kind of place we're talking about." From that point of view, caves start to look less like mystical factories for magic bullets and more like knowledge vaults. Spaces where you can rehearse in safety what you'll have to face in lethal circumstances. This is where the classroom idea comes in. Imagine being a teenager in a Pleistocene band. You've seen animals at a distance. You've helped butcher carcasses. But you haven't yet run full tilt alongside panicked prey with a spear in your hand and your life on the line. An elder leads you into a deep chamber. They point with the same spear you'll use outside, at a panel showing a charging bison. They outline the arc of its horns, the angle of the shoulder, the narrow window where a thrust might slip behind the ribs. Maybe they pair it with a story. This is how your uncle died, when he misread that posture. The images fix the lesson. The story gives it teeth. You can't practice stampeding a real aurochs herd for fun, but you can mentally rehearse. You can coordinate signals, talk through positions, use the wall as a frozen model of the moving world. Some modern hunter-gatherer groups do similar things without caves. They sketch in sand, carve on wood, use body painting to lay out tactics and dangerous situations. There's no reason Paleolithic people couldn't have done the same with rock. At this point, though, it's tempting to swing the pendulum all the way to it's just a school and throw out the magic. That's its own kind of mistake, because if you live in a world where one misstep means being gored, trampled, or starving, uncertainty isn't just a practical problem, it's an existential one. Here's where the symbolic side returns with a vengeance. Even if the paintings encode very real knowledge, performing actions in front of them, singing, touching, repainting, tracing outlines, can work as a way of psychologically and socially handling risk. You're not just memorizing where the prey's heart sits. You're ritually confronting fear. You're placing the terrifying animal in a bounded space under your gaze, held still by pigment and rock. You're turning a chaotic hunt into something that feels, at least briefly, ordered and negotiable. Anthropologists call this symbolic mediation dangerous. Unpredictable forces are pulled into human systems, stories, images, rituals, where they can be bargained with, tamed, at least in imagination. Whether or not the spirits literally listen is almost beside the point. The process binds the group, aligns expectations, steels nerves. This is why the opposition between utilitarian and ritual explanations is often a false one. Teaching a young hunter where to stand in a drive, and at the same time invoking a spirit master of animals, isn't doing two incompatible things. It's one integrated practice. Knowledge is wrapped in story. Strategy is wrapped in ceremony. The wall image is both diagram and altar. Ethnographic parallels, accounts from recent reindeer hunters, seal hunters, bison hunters are full of this entanglement. People talk very matter-of-factly about migration timing, snow conditions, wind direction, and then in the same breath about taboos, offerings, visions. You don't pick one side and ignore the other. You live in both. But those parallels are also dangerous if we treat them as one-to-one blueprints. Modern hunter-gatherers have tens of thousands more years of cultural drift, contact, and change between them and the Ice Age than we do. Their myths, their specific rules, their explicit cosmologies are their own. At best, they show us the range of ways humans can blend practical skill with symbolic systems around animals and risk. So when we step back from those cave walls, we should resist simple labels. Yes, there are panels that feel almost like instructional diagrams. Yes, there are images that seem loaded with ritual charge. In many cases, they're probably the same images. Hunting magic and hunting knowledge aren't rival theories fighting for the right to explain the art. They're two sides of the same cognitive coin. The need to understand a dangerous world and the equally human need to feel that, somehow, you have a line of communication with it. Once you start thinking in terms of ritual, though, a new temptation appears. If caves can be classrooms and altars at the same time, why not go one step further and turn them into full-blown spirit worlds? That's exactly what a lot of late 20th century researchers did. They looked at the caves and asked, why here? Why drag torches, pigments, scaffolding, and your own exhausted body deep into a place that is cold, cramped, dangerous, and utterly useless for basic survival? You can't live there comfortably. You can't hunt there. You can't grow anything. You can barely breathe when the torches smoke. What caves do give you in spades are things humans everywhere have associated with ritual and the supernatural. They are liminal threshold spaces, neither really outside nor fully inside. You cross a boundary, light to dark, warm to cold, birdsong to drip water, and your own pulse in your ears. They amplify sound strangely. A low chant in some chambers booms like a drum. A shout in others dies in your throat. Footsteps echo back from directions that don't match the tunnels. Your own voice comes from somewhere else. They strip away normal sensory cues. The light falls off a few meters from the torch. Beyond that is blackness dense enough to feel. Your depth perception collapses. A little jag in the wall, caught at the right angle, looks like a face staring back. You don't stumble into the deep zones by accident. You commit to going there, and every step you take away from the entrance makes you more dependent on the group, more dependent on whoever knows the route and controls the light. From a cognitive point of view, this is a perfect recipe for altered states, which is where the trance models come in. Beginning in the 1980s, some researchers argued that the geometric patterns in cave art, dots, grids, zigzags, nested curves, weren't just random decoration. They looked eerily like the entoptic phenomena people report during altered states of consciousness. Migraines, high fevers, sensory deprivation, certain drugs, deep trance. Our visual system isn't just a camera, it's a set of neural circuits that can misfire or start to see its own internal noise. Under the right conditions, darkness, rhythmic sound, hyperventilation, stress, those circuits can produce recurring shapes, lattices, tunnels, radiating lines, spirals, flickering zigzags. In lab studies and in ethnographic accounts, these patterns show up again and again. Some archaeologists looked at Paleolithic caves packed with similar motifs and said, that's not a coincidence. People are painting what they saw on the inner screen of the mind. They took it further. In many cultures that use trance deliberately, these early entoptic phases are just the doorway. People report moving through the grids and tunnels into full-blown visions, landscapes populated by animals, spirits, composite beings that are part human, part something else. Now look back at Paleolithic art. You have walls where abstract signs cluster near the entrance or along passageways, and then, deeper in, huge dynamic animal scenes and a few extremely strange figures. Half human, half lion, human body with bird head, a bison man with a tail and erection. The kind of thing you wouldn't see on an ordinary day outside the cave. For trance theorists, this sequence, entoptic-like signs plus deep zone hybrids, is a smoking gun. The story writes itself. Small groups enter the cave. They drum or chant. Some individuals, maybe specialists, go into altered states. They travel in vision to the spirit world, meet animal powers, merge with them. Then afterwards, or during the group anchors parts of that experience on the wall. The cave becomes a shared map of the spirit journey. That's where shamanism enters the conversation. In anthropology, shaman doesn't just mean any ritual person, it refers to a particular pattern. Individuals who deliberately enter trance, often with drumming, dancing, drugs or fasting, to interact with non-human beings on behalf of the group. They negotiate for game, healing, weather, success, fertility. They often have animal helpers or alter egos. They might wear masks, antlers, feathers. They often describe themselves as part animal, part human during the trance. So when Ice Age art shows a human figure with animal features, a deer man, a bird man, a lion man, it's very tempting to say, there, that's your shaman. That's the person in transformation, caught mid-journey between worlds. Add to that the cave's liminality, the acoustics, the darkness, and you end up with a very powerful package. Deep caves are sanctuaries. The art is a byproduct of trance. Therianthropes are shamans in mid-shape shift. The dots and zigzags are neural fireworks from altered states. You can see the ritual right there in Pigment, but when you go looking for harder archaeological correlates of that whole scenario, the record is mixed. We do find hearths in deep caves, clear evidence of repeated fires maintained in front of certain panels. That suggests time spent, maybe performances, maybe repeated visits. We find clusters of broken or deliberately placed objects, flint blades stuck in cracks, bare bones stacked oddly, stalagmites rearranged, coloured stones carried from outside and left in niches. Some chambers have floors disturbed in ways that don't look like simple passage. People were milling, turning, perhaps dancing. There are hand and finger marks that look like people running their palms over the same figures again and again, repainting outlines, retracing curves. That could be reverential, almost devotional. But we don't find unambiguous altars with clear offerings lined up like beads on a string. We don't find standardized shrines that look the same across dozens of caves. We don't find the kind of dense, repeated paraphernalia you get in, say, a Neolithic temple. Statues, heaps of sacrificed animals, burnt residues of special plants in every corner. Psychoactive plant traces may be at a few sites in very low quantities, but nothing that lets us say, yes, this was a dedicated drug den. And remember, hyperventilation, chanting, darkness, and fear can get you pretty far into altered states without a single hallucinogenic plant. So where does that leave us? Some scholars argue the whole shamanism package is overreach. They point out that entoptic patterns are also just good ways to fill space and structure a surface. Dots and lines and grids show up in many contexts that have nothing to do with trance, weaving, basketry, counting systems, clan markers. They warn about the one-size-fits-all trap. Once you decide Ice Age art is shamanic, every odd figure becomes a shaman, every dot a vision, every cave a spirit world. You stop seeing the differences between sites, between periods, between regions. You cherry-pick ethnographic parallels from societies separated by tens of thousands of years and continents, and you back-project their detailed cosmologies into a time when we have no direct testimony at all. Others push back from the opposite side. They say it's equally naive to imagine people doing everything in those conditions with a cool, detached, scientific mindset. Of course intense rituals happened. Of course some individuals had reputations for being better than others at dealing with the invisible. Of course some images were felt to be alive, potent, dangerous. The most defensible position, at least right now, lives in between. Some caves, some chambers, almost certainly hosted powerful rituals, maybe including trance. The setting practically begs for it, and the art in those spaces often has that charged, uncanny quality that's hard to mistake. In other places, the same species, the same symbols, might have been used in relatively sober ways, teaching, planning, commemorating hunts, marking groups, tracking seasons. The same person could move along that spectrum over the course of a single day. In the morning they explain to a youngster which way a bison turns when it's spooked. At night, in the same chamber, they chant before that bison's painted body, asking for mercy, courage, or luck. When we talk about ritual, shamanism, and altered states underground, the key is to keep the plural in mind. Not one universal Paleolithic religion stamped identically onto every cave, but many local traditions, many ways of using deep, difficult, echoing spaces to think and feel through the risks of life. The caves give us hints of ecstasy and fear, of performance and secrecy. They don't give us a script, so we can say ritual is plausible, probable, even in some contexts, trance and specialists, maybe in others. What we shouldn't do is assume that every zigzag is a vision report, or that every hybrid figure is a shaman caught in transformation. Because there's another layer we haven't really touched yet. The caves don't just shape vision and emotion. They shape sound, and sound may have been just as important as any pigment on the wall. If you start listening to the caves instead of just looking at them, something very strange pops into focus. In the 1980s and 90s, a handful of researchers began doing exactly that. They walked into painted caves with notepads and tuning forks and ridiculous determination, and asked a question nobody had really pushed hard before. Do the pictures line up with the way the cave sounds? Not in some vague, mystical sense, but in a measurable, mappable way. Take a long gallery. Some spots swallow your voice. Others throw it back at you doubled, or focus it like a beam. Certain chambers have a very clear resonance. You hum or clap, and the rock answers with a ringing tone, like you've just woken up a buried bell. When people started systematically mapping those acoustic hotspots and then overlaying the maps on the distribution of paintings and engravings, a pattern began to emerge. Places with the strongest echoes, the most dramatic resonance, very often carried the densest, most elaborate or most striking images. Not every time, not in every cave, but often enough that pure coincidence started to feel like a weak explanation. Sometimes the match is almost uncanny. In parts of Neo in France, loud claps explode into rolling echoes that feel like distant thunder or herds on the move, and right there you get black bison and horses, bodies tilted as if in motion. In other sites, you can stand in the part of the chamber where a low chant swells into a standing wave, and you're directly beneath a tight cluster of signs or a big dominating animal. It's as if, at least in some cases, the artists weren't just painting an available wall. They were painting the point where the cave itself spoke the loudest. If that's true, then the architecture of Ritual Underground wasn't only visual. It was acoustic. Think about what you can do with sound in that setting. Deep in the dark line of sight is terrible. A single bend in the passage, and you can't see the torch in front of you. But sound snakes around corners. A voice at one end of a resonant gallery can address people spread out along the walls. A drum beat in a particular niche can pulse through the whole chamber and make your chest vibrate. That's a powerful tool for ceremony. You can imagine a group entering the main cavity and stopping where the echo turns one singer into a small choir. The paintings at that focus point become the front of the space, not because there are pews lined up, but because the acoustics declare, this is where the voice is strongest, this is where the story lands. Storytelling itself changes in that environment. A narrator describing a dangerous hunt under a painted panel of wounded aurochs might punctuate the moment of impact with a stomp or a clap that slams back from the wall. A chorus line of voices could call out the names of animals, their cries bouncing weirdly around the chamber, while flickering torchlight animates the painted herd. No need for a modern orchestra. The cave is the instrument. Rock surfaces, side tunnels, overhangs, each one shapes the way sound swells, snaps or fades. Learning those properties takes time and repetition. It's a kind of acoustic knowledge, where to stand to be heard, where to move if you want your voice to disappear, which panels boom, which only murmur. And crucially, you can coordinate people with sound. In complete or near complete darkness, call and response singing keeps the group together. Rhythmic clapping or drumming lets dispersed participants stay in sync, even when they can't see one another. A shout from the leader at the resonant focus point can cue movements, gestures, maybe even the reveal of certain images as torches are lifted or turned. Archaeologists trying to test this aren't just going in and saying, wow, that echo is cool. They're doing careful work, measuring reverberation times, mapping where certain frequencies get amplified, recording how the sound field changes as you move through a tunnel. Then they take those acoustic maps and compare them to the spatial distribution of motifs. Are there more paintings at high resonance spots than you'd expect by chance? Are certain kinds of images, large animals, complex sign clusters, rare hybrid beings, disproportionately located where the acoustics are the most dramatic? Do undecorated stretches, by contrast, tend to fall in acoustically dead zones? At some caves, the answer is yes. There's a statistically significant correlation between echo strength and image placement. At others, the pattern is weaker or absent, which is exactly what you'd expect if sound mattered a lot in some contexts and much less in others. Because there are perfectly good non-acoustic reasons to put a painting in a particular place. Some stretches of wall are just better canvases, flatter, lighter in colour, less fractured. Sometimes the most accessible panel is the one people use because they're painting by torchlight in awkward positions and don't want to dangle over a shaft for hours. Airflow matters too. Torches need oxygen, smoke needs somewhere to go. Chambers with decent air circulation are more comfortable and safer to work in, which means more time for planning, repainting, adding new figures. Those same conditions also happen to be better for preserving pigments: less condensation, fewer mineral drips, more stable temperatures. So an echo hotspot might end up full of art, not because the echo was sacred in itself, but because that's where people could breathe and see and paint on a nice surface. We have to hold all of those variables together. It's not acoustics or practicality. It can be both, layered. Even if we set aside the idea of music in a modern sense. No orchestras, no harmonic scales, no written notation, sound is still part of meaning. A chant around a bison panel doesn't have to be tuneful to be powerful. A single repeated syllable that booms off the walls, or a low hum that makes the rock seem to vibrate, can mark a boundary between ordinary time and ritual time. Certain cries or rhythms might be reserved for specific animals, specific seasons, specific kinds of gathering. When those vocal patterns are physically tied to particular spots, this is where the bison ounces, this is where the horse runs in the echo. The cave becomes a memory palace wired not just to vision, but to sound and movement, which implies something important about planning. These people weren't blindly stumbling into a chamber, slapping pigment wherever, and leaving. At least in some caves, they were treating the underground space like an instrument to be tuned. They learned, through repetition, which niches carried a voice, which stalagmites sang back, where a drumbeat turned into thunder. Then they anchored images to those places. That looks a lot like architecture, not with bricks and blueprints, but with choices about where bodies, voices, and symbols go in relation to one another. In that sense, the deepest decorated caves are not just art galleries or shrines. They're built environments, sculpted in sound as much as in stone. And once you start thinking of them as carefully organized spaces, it opens the door to another line of speculation. If the walls are laid out with this much intention, maybe some of that intention isn't just about spirits and stories. Maybe it's about tracking something even more abstract, unfolding over much longer cycles, written not only in echoes, but in time. If you spend enough time with those dots and lines and clusters on the walls, one particular temptation becomes almost impossible to ignore. What if this isn't just sound and story? What if some of it is the sky? People don't jump to that idea randomly. There are specific things in the caves that keep poking at the back of the brain. You get repeated patterns of dots, 3 in a row, then 3 again, then a group of 7 that shows up in more than one cave. You get particular animals that always seem to be paired with particular signs. Horses plus long rows of ticks, bison plus clusters of dots. Aurochs and stags near certain abstract shapes. And you get repetition across distance and time. A motif that appears in a cave in France 30,000 years ago pops up again, in slightly altered form, in Spain 10,000 years later. Same animal, same kind of little marks hovering beside it. At some point, people start saying, this looks like a code. And once code is on the table, astronomy is never far behind. Because if there's one giant, slow, reliable thing that all humans share, it's the sky. But we have to separate two very different levels of claim that often get tangled together. On one level you have seasonal tracking. That's the idea that the paintings or the signs around the animals help mark when certain events happen. When herds arrive, when salmon run, when the snow usually melts, when it's time to move camp or start a particular ritual. You don't need constellations for that. You just need to notice repeating cycles. The lengthening and shortening of days. The way the same animals tend to appear at the river at roughly the same point in the year. The phases of the moon. On another level you have full-blown star mapping. the claim that particular animals in the caves stand for specific constellations, that dot clusters are literal star clusters, that whole panels are schematic diagrams of the night sky encoded in paint. Those are very different propositions. Seasonal tracking is almost guaranteed. Any forager group, living through harsh winters and short summers, has to know the pulse of the year in exquisite detail, or they die. They have eyes, they have memories, they have language. They are going to notice patterns. Star mapping, especially precise constellations that correspond closely to the ones we use now, is a much heavier lift. It's not impossible, it's just a much stronger claim, and it needs much stronger evidence. So what could Ice Age people actually see lying on their backs outside the cave mouth at night? Pretty much everything we can, and in some ways more. No light pollution, no cities, no car headlights, just a naked eye sky that is genuinely overwhelming. The Milky Way as a bright river, the zodiac constellations rising and setting, bright planets wandering slowly against the star background. The moon is obvious. Its phases swing through a full cycle in about 29.5 days. You can't miss that if you're outside at night year after year. The way it rises later each night, arcs higher or lower with the seasons, occasionally eclipses the sun. All that is visible without any instruments. They could also have watched what astronomers call heliacal risings, the first morning of the year when a particular bright star, after being hidden in the sun's glare, reappears just before dawn. Those events are highly regular. In later historic societies, they become the backbone of agricultural calendars. There's no reason Ice Age observers couldn't notice the same thing, even if they didn't have words like heliacal or Sirius. So yes, they had access to a very stable, extremely information-rich sky. The question is, did they encode any of that in the caves? This is where things get messy because our own pattern-finding brains are both the tool and the trap. One major pitfall is confirmation bias. If you go into a cave wanting to find the Pleiades or Orion or Taurus, you can almost always succeed. Draw lines between enough dots and some arrangement will resemble the constellation you're hoping for, especially if you allow yourself to ignore the dots that don't fit or stretch the pattern until it sort of matches. Another problem is retrofitting. We project our modern constellation system backwards and assume it must have existed basically unchanged, 20 or 30 or 40,000 years ago. But constellations are cultural. They differ between societies even today. There's no reason Ice Age Europeans had to see a bull where we see a bull, or a hunter where we see a hunter. Then there's the selective dataset issue. Many of the boldest astronomy claims in cave art rely on a very small number of panels that seem to fit nicely, while quietly setting aside dozens or hundreds of images that don't cooperate. If only a tiny fraction of the dots and clusters line up with your sky interpretation, is that evidence of a deep code or evidence that, given enough random dots, some of them will line up with almost anything? So, what would strong evidence look like? At minimum, you'd want consistency. The same animal paired with the same pattern of dots, in multiple caves, spanning centuries or millennia, in a way that can't be easily explained by accident. You'd want those patterns to match real, astronomically meaningful groupings like prominent star clusters or regular seasonal events, in a way that isn't just kind of similar if you squint. You'd also hope for structure. Maybe sequences of marks that match the length of lunar cycles, or repeated counts that line up with important intervals in the solar year. Better yet, you'd want those sequences to appear in ordered ways along a passage or wall, not scattered randomly. And you'd want negative evidence too, clear cases where the pattern should appear but doesn't, so you can actually test the hypothesis rather than just collecting hits. Only then can we start to argue that some part of the cave system is functioning as a timekeeping device or a star map, rather than a coincidence generator. In the last few decades, a handful of researchers have stepped forward and said, we have exactly that kind of evidence, or at least the beginnings of it. They argue that certain animals encode specific constellations, that repeated dot counts track lunar months, that some caves are nothing less than deep-time observatories. Other archaeologists and astronomers are much more skeptical. They point to all the pitfalls we've just walked through, the cherry-picking, the backward projection, the way humans can force patterns onto almost anything. In the next part, we'll look directly at those competing claims, the boldest versions of the animal equals constellation idea, the data they're built on, and the best arguments for why Ice Age cave art might, just might, be our oldest surviving astronomy textbook, or why it probably isn't. So let's talk about the bold version. Not just these people noticed the seasons, not just they maybe tracked moons. The strong claim goes like this. Ice Age artists were using specific animals as symbols for specific constellations. Those animal constellation pairs formed a kind of zodiac. And by combining them with groups of dots seen as counts of months or years, they were encoding precise dates, birthdays of myths, anniversaries of floods, timestamps for comet strikes. If that sounds wild, it is. But it's also not just something people are saying on Reddit. There are actual published papers pushing some version of this argument. Here's the basic move. Step 1. Pick a panel with an animal and nearby dots. For example, a bull or bison with a tight little spray of 7 points above or near it. Step 2. Notice that we have a modern constellation, Taurus the bull, with the Pleiades star cluster, 7-ish stars on its back. Step 3. Say, okay, the bull is Taurus, the 7 dots are the Pleiades. Now, if we know when Taurus rose heliacally in the deep past, and we know how the slow wobble of Earth's axis, precession shifts that timing over thousands of years, we can use that like a calculator. We can dial the sky backwards until the configuration implied by the painting lines up with a real sky date. You then repeat this with other animals. Horse might equal Sagittarius. Lion might equal Leo. Ibex might be Capricorn. You assemble a lookup table. Animal equals constellation. Dot count equals number of lunar months or years. With that table in hand, you go cave by cave and try to decode. If the decoded dates cluster around important climatic events, massive temperature swings, meltwater pulses, maybe even specific known impacts, then the argument tightens. It's no longer just this drawing looks like Taurus. It becomes this whole system is a prehistoric archive of catastrophic events, keyed to the stars. That's the promise. Technically, the machinery behind it sounds impressive. Precession really does shift the backdrop of stars behind the Sun over a roughly 26,000-year cycle. The heliacal rising date of, say, the Pleiades relative to the solstices is not constant. Astronomers can model that backwards quite precisely. So in principle, yes, if you knew which constellation was which, and which star cluster mattered, you could attach a date to a coded reference. Future astronomers do this with ancient texts all the time, but every part of that sentence hides an assumption. First, that the animal really does stand for that constellation and not something else. Second, that the 7 dots really are the Pleiades and not 7 in some completely different sense, or not even 7, just a little spray where the artist happened to put the paint. Third, that Ice Age observers were using precession as a historical yardstick, not just noticing repeating annual events. Fourth, that the mapping you've constructed from a handful of famous panels works everywhere else in the system, and that you're not quietly rotating, stretching or relabeling constellations when they don't fit. And then there's the math problem hiding behind the math. Once you start playing with precession, you get an enormous menu of possible solutions. The sky is periodic. Many different dates will give you some kind of plausible alignment. If your rules are even a little bit flexible, you can almost always find a date that works for a given panel. That's where the statistical arguments come in. Proponents will say, look, we haven't just eyeballed a couple of pretty panels. We've taken a sample of caves, applied our decoding scheme, and the resulting dates match big climatic events, way more often than chance would allow. They'll run probability calculations and come back with tiny p-values, 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million. On paper, it looks like a smoking gun. The problem is, statistics are only as honest as the question you actually ask. If you try one decoding scheme on a pre-registered dataset, with clear rules that you don't change halfway through, and you still get a very low probability of random match, that's impressive. But that's not usually what's happening here. Instead, you have what statisticians call multiple testing. You try lots of different animal to constellation mappings. You shift your precession windows a bit. You decide which dots count and which don't. You tinker with which climatic events you're allowed to hit, this spike, or that one, or maybe the one 500 years earlier. Each tweak increases the chance that something will line up by accident. If you don't account for all those tries in your final probability, your p-value becomes basically meaningless. It's the birthday paradox. But for hypotheses, the more shots you take, the less surprising it is that one of them scores. Critics also hammer on ambiguity. A painted bison might be interpreted as a generic great herbivore. A lion might be any big predator. Constellations themselves are fuzzy. Which stars count as the body? How do you rotate the pattern on the celestial sphere to make it fit the panel? If you allow yourself to stretch, flip, and ignore outlying stars, most dense star patches can be made to resemble most small dot clusters. That's where circular reasoning creeps in. You decide ahead of time that a cave is astronomical. You pick the panels that look the most promising. You build your animal constellation list on those. Then you turn around and say, look, these panels confirm the list. The hypothesis is being tested with the same data that created it. So where does that leave us? Not in this is obviously nonsense territory. There are genuinely intriguing regularities, certain animals showing up with certain kinds of marks across wide spans of space and time. Some dot counts do seem to cluster around numbers that matter for lunisolar cycles. A few specific cases, the bull plus 7 dots, for example, are hard to unsee once pointed out. But we're also not in Ice Age people definitely had a zodiac and were dating impacts territory. The chain of inference is long, the assumptions are many. The negative evidence, the panels that don't fit, the caves that stubbornly refuse to cooperate, gets less attention than it should. The most responsible position right now is somewhere in the middle. It is entirely plausible that some cave signs and animal pairings functioned as proto-calendars, memory aids for tracking parts of the year, maybe even keyed to rough star patterns or lunar counts. It is not yet demonstrated that we're looking at a fully worked out, precise, precessional dating system comparable to later written astronomy. The code idea is compelling because it promises a way to hear Ice Age people speak across tens of thousands of years. But before we translate, we need a much stronger grammar. In the meantime, there's another angle that might actually be easier to support, and just as mind-bending. Even if the caves aren't star charts, they might still be sophisticated memory systems. Not writing exactly, but something uncomfortably close. That's where we're headed next. Think about what memory even is for a moment. Inside your skull, it's patterns of strength between neurons. Outside your skull, it can be almost anything. A notch on a stick, a pile of rocks left at a crossroads. A story an elder tells every winter, always in the same place, with the same gestures. Anthropologists have a phrase for this, external memory. Ways of storing knowledge in the world so that a human mind doesn't have to hold everything at once. Now imagine you're living in a world with no writing, no diagrams, no Google. But you still need to remember which valley floods every 7th spring, where the edible plants sprout after the snowmelt, and which ones will kill you, who you're allowed to marry and who is taboo because of some ancestral promise, which cave is safe to shelter in and which one belongs to powers you do not disturb. That's a lot of information. Oral cultures solve this problem using something we're very bad at imagining from the comfort of literate societies. They turn the entire landscape into a memory palace. This isn't speculation, we can watch it in action. Australian Aboriginal songlines map journeys across the land with verses tied to specific rocks, hills, waterholes. Polynesian navigators memorize star paths, swell patterns and bird behaviours as tightly structured chants. Indigenous American groups encode harvesting times, clan histories and ritual rules into stories that must be told in a particular order at particular locations. You don't carry a book, you carry roots, songs and rituals that are anchored to things outside you. The bend in the river is a prompt. The hill that looks like a sleeping animal is a prompt. A carved pole, a painted rock face, a pile of bones, all prompts. The cave paintings slot perfectly into that logic. Think of a deep cave, not as a prehistoric art gallery, but as a tightly curated corridor of memory. Each chamber, each panel, each repeated sign is a hook. Not the content itself, but an index that tells you which content to pull out of your head. You see a panel of bison with a particular pattern of dots and lines. If you grew up in that culture, that combination might instantly call up the story of the hungry winter when the bison didn't come, the rule about never hunting pregnant cows on their first arrival, the route you take to follow their migration, including the one dangerous crossing where children must be carried. For us, it's an image. For them, it might have been a chapter title. Once you think of the caves as giant mnemonic structures, a bunch of puzzling features start to look less weird. Take the repetition. Certain abstract signs, claviforms, chevrons, tectiforms, simple lines and dots show up in cave after cave over tens of thousands of years. They're not detailed pictures of anything. They're like logos or musical riffs. In oral cultures, repetition isn't boring. It's the hard drive. You repeat a form because that's what makes it rememberable and teachable. A sign that always looks roughly the same in the same kind of context becomes a stable cue. When you see it, you don't have to figure out what it means from scratch. You just have to recall the stories and rules that go with it. The cognitive archaeology angle backs this up. When archaeologists talk about symbol use, they're not just saying this is pretty, they're looking for evidence that a mark or object stands for something beyond itself, and that this mapping is shared across individuals and generations. Standardized signs, restricted contexts, long chronological persistence. Those are all hints that you're dealing with a system, not random doodles. And abstraction, moving away from literal depiction towards shapes that have meaning only because people agree they do, is a huge cognitive leap. It's the same step that makes traffic lights, musical notation, and algebra possible. We can see that step being taken in the caves. Animals are often vividly naturalistic, muscles, fur, movement, but right next to them you get stark, simple marks, rectangles, branching lines, enigmatic ladder shapes. It's as if the same minds that could paint a horse mid-gallop were also experimenting with a tiny graphic vocabulary stripped of everything except what was needed to jog memory. So what might these mnemonic systems have been about if not constellations and impact dates? Plenty of candidates, and they don't compete with each other. Some panels might index migration routes, Move along this river until you reach the landmark shaped like this animal. Others might cue seasonal tasks. When the salmon sign appears in the story sequence, it's time to think about nets and traps. Some could be about taboos and dangers. Don't drink from that spring. Don't hunt in that valley in this month. Don't sleep in that cave unless the proper ritual has been done. Kinship itself, who is us, who is them, who can marry whom, can be encoded in totems and clan animals. A certain sign might mean this place is held by the people of the horse, or only those linked to the bison have the right to perform this ceremony. The painting becomes part title deed, part family tree, part ethics manual. And because we're dealing with oral transmission, teaching is everything. How do you make sure a teenager remembers a complex hunting protocol or a long genealogical chain? You walk them through the cave and you recite. You point at each panel, each sign, each animal, and you tell the story it unlocks. You test them. What happens after this one? If they stumble, you're still standing in front of the prompt that can pull the right sequence back into place. In that sense, the cave isn't just a memory aid for individuals. It's a training device for the whole group, a place where knowledge is rehearsed, refreshed, and standardized. None of this means we should upgrade the caves to writing in the strict sense. Writing, as scholars use the term, is a system where marks on a surface can encode speech with enough precision that a competent reader who never met the author can reconstruct the words. We don't have any evidence that Ice Age caves got that far. We don't see long, linear sequences of signs that look like sentences. We don't see clear one-to-one correspondences between marks and sounds. Whatever is going on isn't yet phonetic script. But not writing doesn't mean just art. The middle ground is actually more interesting. These are graphic memory technologies. Systems of symbols and images that help brains store, retrieve, and teach very complex packages of information, without ever freezing language into text. In that space, it suddenly makes sense that you'd invest enormous effort, over generations, into repainting, touching up, and revisiting the same images in the same caves. You're not just preserving beauty, you're maintaining the long-term memory of your people. And if that's right, then we have to rethink what it meant to walk into those painted chambers. You weren't simply entering a prehistoric Louvre, you were stepping into a library, a dark, echoing, dangerous library where every wall could talk if you knew the code. If the cave is a library, the next question is obvious. Who has a library card? Not everyone, and not everywhere, is treated the same way underground. When archaeologists map the distribution of art in a cave, they keep seeing the same pattern. Some images sit near big entrances and spacious galleries. Others are tucked so far back that you have to crawl, squeeze, and risk your life to reach them. That's not an accident of geology, that's access control. The mouth of a cave or the first few chambers are relatively easy. Light from the entrance reaches a little way in. Fires are simple to manage. Kids can run around, and in many sites, that's where you see hand stencils, finger flutings, engraved lines at arm height, marks that feel participatory, almost casual. The deep sanctuaries are another world, to get to the famous lion panel at Chauvet or the apse and shaft at Lascaux. You don't just stroll. You maneuver along narrow ledges, descend slippery drops, sometimes cross chasms on improvised bridges. Doing that in flickering torchlight is dangerous even for modern researchers with helmets and backup crews. So ask yourself, are you taking the whole camp there? Toddlers, elderly, everyone? Probably not. The architecture of the cave itself creates a filtering system. At each bottleneck, each precarious climb, each tight squeeze, the group likely shrinks. By the time you reach the deepest painted chambers, you're down to a small set of people willing and allowed to go that far. That's how you turn space into a social boundary. The outer areas can be more communal, gatherings, initiation rites, shared storytelling. The inner sanctums become restricted zones where only certain roles at certain times are permitted to cross that last threshold. Within that smaller circle, not everyone is doing the same thing either. Skill levels in the paintings are wildly uneven. In some caves, a single panel will show a breathtakingly accurate horse overlaying a clumsy, almost cartoonish earlier figure. Other walls are covered with hesitant lines, corrections, ghost images where someone started and then abandoned a form. This is what you expect when there are specialists and learners. A few individuals, maybe only one or two per generation, seem to have mastered the entire technical package. How to grind pigments, how to blend charcoal into soft shading, how to use the bulges of rock to create 3D illusions, how to plan a multi-animal scene that flows along the wall. Those hands, once you start noticing them, keep showing up. Same proportions, same way of drawing hooves or horns, same preferences in subject. Around them you get what looks like practice. Simpler figures, overpainted attempts, bulked outlines, apprentices trying to copy the maestro and gradually getting better. At the broadest level, the community participates. Hand stencils, finger tracings in soft surfaces, maybe colouring sections of a figure. But the core images that anchor the chapters in this underground library? Those were probably controlled by a small class of expert image makers. And those experts weren't working in a vacuum. They were working for and inside a social system. One of the strongest hints that images are tied to identity is repetition with a twist. Certain caves consistently favour specific animals or signs, even when other options were available. One region leans heavily into ibex and specific abstract marks. Another is obsessed with bison. Yet another peppers everything with one particular ladder-like sign or a specific way of drawing horses' heads. These aren't just they liked that animal. They start to look like graphic dialects, visual accents that say, "This is us." In a world where different bands meet seasonally, trade, intermarry, and sometimes fight, you need ways to mark who belongs where. Totemic animals and recurring sign sets can do that. A particular combination on a wall might mean this place is under the protection of the people of the Aurochs. Another cave with another visual package signals a different group or a different clan within the same larger network. Once group identity is bound up with particular images, control over those images becomes a form of power. If only certain elders, ritual specialists or lineages are allowed to paint the central animals, they're not just preserving style. They're asserting authority. We are the ones who talk to the powers in the dark. We are the ones who maintain the stories. We are the ones who decide when this ritual is done. That's speculation, but it lines up with what we see in many later societies. Shamans, priests, or chiefs often monopolize the most dangerous or prestigious rituals. They're the ones who handle the sacred objects, who know the songs, who can interpret signs and omens. In an Ice Age setting, a painted cave is a giant sacred object, and the expertise to update or activate it would be a potent source of legitimacy. This doesn't mean that only high-status men were involved, though, and this is where we have to tread carefully between evidence and projection. For a long time, popular imagination filled the caves with male hunters, making hunting magic, while women and children stayed somewhere vague in the background. But when researchers began looking closely at hand stencils, comparing finger lengths, palm proportions, ring sizes, they found something awkward for that old story. Many of those hands are more consistent with female anatomy and with adolescence. The sample sizes are small, the method has margins of error, and sexual dimorphism varies. We can't point at a stencil and say, "This is definitely a teenage girl, and she definitely led this ritual." But we also can't keep pretending that the only plausible painter is a burly adult male hunter. Finger flutings, those sinuous lines drawn by dragging fingers through soft cave surfaces, show similar variety. Some were made by small hands, some by big. In a few cases, repeated flutings in different parts of a cave seem to match the same small hand, suggesting a child or adolescent moving deliberately through the system. So the safest thing to say is, cave art is a product of complex social roles that involved multiple ages and probably multiple genders. Some tasks mixing pigment, holding lights, singing or drumming, acting in the story being told could include everyone present. Others placing the key figures on the deepest wall might be restricted to a few. Whatever the exact division of labour, the social function of all this activity is huge. Imagine an initiation. A group of young people is led from the bright outside world into the dark. They stop in the outer chambers, where everyone can gather. Stories are told, chants performed. Then a smaller group goes further, into spaces most people see only a handful of times in their lives. There, in front of the oldest, most powerful images, they watch as a specialist touches up a bison, adds a new sign, or traces their hand next to generations of ancestors. That's not just memory training, that's bonding. You're being stitched into a lineage that stretches backward through whoever first painted here and forward through whoever will repaint after you. And because these ceremonies and images repeat over centuries, maybe millennia, they create something truly rare in a mobile, foraging world, a stable, shared sense of we. We are the people who go into this cave. We are the ones who know what these shapes mean. We are the descendants of the hands already on this wall. In that way, the cave isn't just a library and isn't just a temple. It's a machine for manufacturing social identity, by deciding who gets to paint, who gets to see, and who has to stay in the light outside and wait. All of this, the control over who paints, who watches, who belongs, would be overkill if the world outside was simple and predictable. It wasn't. The people going into these caves were living through one of the wildest climate roller coasters in recent Earth history. When we say Ice Age, we tend to picture a single frozen block of time, mammoths on snowy plains, everyone shivering non-stop. The reality is messier. The last glacial period was punctuated by abrupt warmings, sudden cold snaps, shifts in rainfall patterns, and changes in vegetation that could transform a landscape within a few generations. To you, born into that world, normal doesn't really exist. You grow up hearing that when your grandparents were young, winters were shorter, or the reindeer passed further west, or a valley that's now empty once teemed with bison. The elders tell stories about a river that used to freeze solid every year, and now only ices over some winters. Climate variability isn't background noise, it's the main plot. And when climate flickers, everything else flickers with it. Plant communities move, lakes shrink or expand, herd animals shift their migration routes. A valley that's a paradise for 10 years can turn into a trap when snow lingers just a little too long or a key plant fails to sprout. If your group guesses wrong about where the animals will be, or when the salmon will run, you don't just have a bad season. You could lose half your children. Under those conditions, information about the environment becomes life or death currency. Knowing when horses tend to congregate in a particular gorge, which year the ibex came late, where the bison veered when a drought dried up their usual watering holes, that's not trivia. That's the kind of knowledge that separates lineages that keep going from lineages that vanish. One way to hold that knowledge is purely in memory. Stories, songs, instructions passed around the fire. But there's a problem. In small, mobile bands, people die at the wrong time. Groups fission and fuse, famine and disease can wipe out an entire age cohort. A few unlucky years, and the only person who really knew that tricky migration route is gone. So imagine having, in your territory, a place that doesn't move. The hills can change their vegetation, the river can change its course. But that cave mouth opens in the same cliff generation after generation. Inside, the temperature barely varies. There's no sunlight to fade pigments. No rain to wash off charcoal. If you can afford the time and risk to go in and mark that space, what you place on those walls has a better chance of outliving you than anything you do outside. That's one of the reasons some researchers talk about caves as archives. Not archives in the bureaucratic sense, with neat rows of labelled folders, but archives in the sense of deliberately durable memory. When you paint the same animals your ancestors painted aurochs here, horses there, rhinos on that curve of rock, you're not just decorating. You're layering information into a physical structure that persists across unstable centuries. And when the climate record from outside lines up with the picture inside, that gets harder to dismiss as coincidence. Pollen cores from lakes and bogs near famous cave sites show what kinds of plants were around at different moments. At times when the environment was more steppe-like, cold, dry grasslands, you see more horses, bison and mammoth in both the fossil record and the cave art. When conditions shift toward patchier woodlands or moister climates, the fauna changes. More red deer, ibex, maybe more small game, and you start seeing those animals rise in painted prominence. In some regions, the painted species match not just what was present, but what was economically crucial. Archaeologists sift through the bones in habitation sites, the camps where people actually butchered and ate, and compare them to the animals in nearby caves. It's not a one-to-one correlation, but there are patterns. Caves heavy with reindeer, where reindeer bones dominate the trash heaps. Caves obsessed with bison in bison country, shifts in emphasis that track broader environmental reconstructions. Does that prove the caves were maps or calendars? No. It does suggest that the images are at least partly tuned to the real, changing ecology outside. In a world like that, where winters lurch longer or shorter and herd routes drift like slow rivers, continuity is an achievement. Caves help create that continuity on multiple levels at once. Practically, they can stabilize crucial knowledge. Which animals matter here? When they show up, what behaviors to expect? Symbolically, they stabilize something even more fragile: confidence. Ritual and narrative aren't just decorations on top of subsistence. They're tools for staying psychologically and socially coherent when the ground keeps shifting under your feet. If you can wrap the frightening unpredictability of the climate into a story about powerful animals, about cycles of appearance and disappearance, about ancestral journeys, you give yourself a frame that makes the chaos bearable and sometimes navigable. Walking into the cave and seeing the same kinds of figures your people have renewed for centuries tells you, yes, the herds move, the ice advances and retreats, but our pattern continues. We still make the journey inside. We still repaint the bison. We still tell the story that links the last bad winter to this spring's return. At the same time, we need to be careful not to flip into a different kind of simplification. The climate changed, therefore the art changed, therefore climate explains everything. It doesn't. Culture has its own inertia and creativity. Groups can respond to the same environmental shift in very different ways. Two valleys might experience the same cold snap. One group doubles down on old rituals, the other experiments with new motifs or new routes. Some animals may carry religious or clan meanings that keep them central in art long after they've become rare on the landscape. Some images may be tied more to myth than to meat. So when we see a cave full of mammoths in a period when mammoths were thinning out locally, that might not be ecological data. That might be nostalgia or identity, or a story about the first times that has to feature those huge, dangerous beings, whether or not anyone's hunted one lately. The most responsible position is a both and. Ice Age art sits in a matrix where climate, migration, subsistence, ritual, identity, and sheer aesthetic joy are all pulling at once. The swings in temperature and rainfall raise the stakes on information. The mobility pressures push people to develop better ways of remembering routes, seasons, and animal behavior. The caves offer a rare, stable canvas where that remembering can be anchored. Ritual and narrative wrap those practical concerns in meaning so that people care enough to maintain them. In that sense, the paintings are not just about survival, but they are absolutely entangled with it. And that entanglement is what makes the most ambitious hypotheses about these images, especially the idea that they record time itself, so tempting. If you're already turning animals into carriers of environmental memory, how far does that process go? To see just how far it might go, we need to visit a place that keeps making archaeologists uneasy: Chauvet. If you've only ever seen Ice Age art as rough outlines and stick figures, Chauvet feels like cheating. These paintings are among the very oldest known deep cave images in Europe, some of them around 36,000 years old, maybe older, and yet they look like the work of people who've been doing this for centuries. The animals move, not literally of course, but the illusion is there. Lines overlap and repeat to suggest muscles in motion. A pride of cave lions stalks across the wall in a kind of frozen sequence, each head turned just slightly, each body overlapping the next. Rhinos clash, their horns drawn multiple times like animation frames. Horses are shaded so their bellies round outward. Some have a hint of three-quarter view, not just flat profiles. Someone is playing with perspective, with foreground and background, with how your eye travels along the wall. They're using the bulges and hollows of the rock to make shoulders swell, flanks recede, heads jut forward into imagined space. Charcoal isn't just smeared on, it's blended, hatched, rubbed, building up tonal gradients that look suspiciously like what a Renaissance artist would call modelling. This is why, when Chauvet was first dated using radiocarbon, a lot of people simply refused to believe it. The early dates said, these masterpieces came very early in the European cave art sequence, not at the end after a long, slow build-up. That upended the comfortable story archaeologists had been telling themselves: crude beginnings, gradual improvement, final flowering in places like Lascaux and Altamira. So the objections started. Maybe the samples were contaminated. Maybe later artists re-entered an older cave. Maybe the advanced panels were much younger than the oldest dates on the floor. It turned into a full-blown dating controversy because, underneath the technical arguments, a deeper assumption was being challenged, that art, like technology, has to march in a straight line from simple to complex. Over time, the evidence piled up. Radiocarbon dates on charcoal from multiple panels. Uranium-thorium dates on the calcite films that drape over some drawings, putting a minimum age beneath a mineral ceiling, stylistic features that match other early sites. The weight of the data now strongly supports the early and amazing picture. Chauvet forces a rethink. It suggests that the capacity for sophisticated image-making was present as soon as, or even before, people started seriously using deep caves as canvases. This wasn't a long apprenticeship, it was a leap. But Chauvet isn't just about virtuoso drawing. It's about how those drawings are arranged. When researchers map the panels, they don't just see random scatter. They see clusters, compositions, almost like curated galleries. One stretch is dominated by horses, another by felines, another by rhinos and mammoths. Within those clusters, animals face particular directions, line up in apparent groups, or converge on key rock features. Stand in the lion panel, and you're surrounded not by a generic menagerie, but by a concentrated presence of one kind of being, powerful, dangerous, mostly unhuntable. That's one of the striking things about Chauvet. Many of the stars of the show, cave lions, woolly rhinos, bears, are not the main items on the dinner menu. They're the things that can kill you, or at least ruin your day. You do see horses, bison, and other prey species, but the emotional centre of gravity seems to tilt toward the dangerous. What does that mean? Some archaeologists lean toward the idea of a sanctuary, a place where the most potent animals of the landscape are encountered in controlled ritual conditions. Others see a storytelling chamber, sequences of lions or rhinos that might have anchored myths about origin times, heroic hunts, or spirit journeys. There's a long-standing suggestion that the cave was an initiation space, where adolescents or specialists were brought into the real story behind the world outside, using these overwhelming images as teaching tools. And then there's a more cognitive angle, Chauvet as a kind of memory theatre. In this view, the cave's architecture and the curated panels work together as a navigable mental map. You move from the horse gallery to the lion gallery to the rhino gallery in a fixed order. Each cluster cues a specific narrative, set of rules, or seasonal knowledge. The lions might carry ideas about territory, danger, and taboo. The rhinos might encode a particular time of year, or a storm season, or a migration turning point. The panels aren't just pictures, they're hooks for structured recall. None of these interpretations has a monopoly on the truth. They can even overlap. A sanctuary can also be an initiation chamber. A mythic storyboard can double as a scheduling device for when certain rituals and certain hunts should happen. The temptation is to take Chauvet's complexity and declare this is the blueprint. All caves must work like this. That's where we have to hit the brakes. Chauvet is a case study in early mastery, not a universal template. Other caves are messier, more experimental, or focused on different animals and themes. Some have very little evidence of revisiting. Others show centuries of repainting. Some emphasize hands and abstract signs over animals. Many lack Chauvet's obsession with predators. What Chauvet really teaches is more modest and, in a way, more radical. As soon as humans were willing to crawl deep into the earth with fire and pigment, they were already capable of astonishing graphic control, deliberate spatial organization, and conceptually layered spaces. In other words, when we look at any cave, famous or obscure, we shouldn't assume we're seeing the clumsy first steps of a slowly awakening mind. We might be walking into a place where people, tens of thousands of years ago, were already juggling aesthetics, emotion, ritual, and memory in ways that still make us nervous about calling them prehistoric. If Chauvet is the uncomfortable reminder that sophistication arrives early, Lascaux and Altamira are the ones that made researchers fall in love in the first place. These are the poster children of Ice Age art. When people picture cave paintings, they're almost always seeing Lascaux's bulls or Altamira's bison in their heads, even if they don't know the names. And those images really are outrageous. In Lascaux's Hall of the Bulls, the animals aren't just drawn, they dominate. Some of the aurochs stretch over 5 meters long. Bodies overlap in dense layers, horns twisting in double perspective, manes and tails flicked into motion. You get polychrome shading, yellows, reds, blacks, built up in smooth gradients, so the flanks look swollen with muscle and fat. Altamira does the same kind of thing with bison. The ceiling is crowded with them, painted in deep reds and blacks. Each animal tucked into a little hollow of rock, so the belly bulges, the back arches, the haunches feel heavy. Some are lying down, some are twisted mid-roll, some are just this massive looming presence above your head. If Chauvet makes you think of delicate line drawings and tonal charcoal, Lascaux and Altamira feel like murals. Big, loud, full colour statements. They're not just showing animals, they're staging them. That alone tells you something important. This is not casual. You don't improvise a 5-metre bull in multiple colours on a curved wall 10 feet off the floor. To pull that off, you need logistics. At Lascaux, there are clear traces that people built scaffolding, some kind of raised platforms or supports, to reach the highest parts of the vault. You're mixing pigments in quantity, maybe grinding ochre and manganese, preparing binders, testing consistencies. Somebody has to source the raw material. Someone has to carry it into the cave. Someone has to tend the lamps so the smoke doesn't choke everyone out. You also need planning. The big panels aren't just random accumulations of animals over centuries. In many spots the compositions look coherent. Bison angled in similar directions, horses grouped, negative space deliberately used so one giant aurochs anchors the scene and others orbit it. That suggests some kind of mental layout. Maybe the lead painter sketches with charcoal first, then comes back with more permanent pigment. Maybe different specialists handle outlines, shading, and final touch-ups. However, it was organised. This is teamwork. More like a crew painting a temple ceiling than a lone hunter doodling between foraging trips. And then, in the middle of this grand bestiary, Lascaux throws us a curveball. The shaft scene, down a tight vertical drop away from the showpiece galleries. There's a small chamber with a very different image. A wounded bison, its intestines apparently spilling out. In front of it, a human figure, stick-like, with outstretched arms, a bird-like or masked head, and an erect penis. Between them, a bird perched on a pole. Nearby, a rhinoceros trudges away. This is one of the almost non-existent scenes in Paleolithic art, where a human appears in what looks like a narrative situation. Something happened here. The problem is, what? Some see a hunting accident, a tale of a hunter gored by a bison. Others read it as a shaman in trance, maybe falling into another world while his animal double is struck. The bird on the pole might be a clan emblem, a staff used in rituals, even a cue for a constellation if you buy the astronomical readings. There are proposals that it's a myth scene, a founding death, a culture hero's sacrifice, some origin story of a group. The sheer weirdness of the figure, the birdy head, the exaggerated penis, the posture, has generated a small library of interpretations. And that's the point. When you strip away the animals and look at one of the very few human-centered scenes, it explodes our confidence. Whatever symbolic world produced Lascaux could support sexually charged imagery, animal-human hybrids, formalized emblems, and maybe complex storylines. We just don't speak the language, Altamira adds another twist. Not so much in content as in later history. When it was first shown to scholars in the late 19th century, many of them declared the paintings fakes. They simply refused to believe prehistoric people could do polychrome ceiling art this good. It took decades and other discoveries before Altamira was accepted as genuine. Then, in the 20th century, the pendulum swung the other way. Tourism surged. Thousands of visitors a year breathed on the bison, raised the temperature and humidity, brought in spores. The paintings started to decay in real time. Microbes bloomed on the walls. The response was brutal but necessary. Close the caves. Today both Lascaux and Altamira are effectively sealed to the general public. What most of us experience are meticulous replicas, Lascaux Do and IV, the Altamira Museum reproductions or high-resolution scans and photographs. Modern technology lets us walk in virtual halls of bulls without shedding moisture on the real ones. That's a strange compromise. The originals are now more like relics in quarantine, while the authentic experience is a simulation built with lasers and cement. But it's revealing in its own way. If a prehistoric image can pull in so many people that it physically threatens the thing itself, that tells you something about its enduring social power. And that loops us back to the people who painted them. Lascaux and Altamira sit at or near the peak of what archaeologists call the Magdalenian period, roughly 17,000 to 12,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherer societies in Western Europe were dense, mobile, and plugged into long-range exchange networks. In that context, these caves start to look less like private shrines and more like major symbolic hubs. The sheer scale and polish of the art, the need for coordination and specialized skill, imply a social world where some individuals had time and training to become expert image makers, where groups could justify investing days or weeks of effort into a place that wasn't producing meat or hides, where gatherings might have been timed around the use of these chambers, ceremonies, initiations, seasonal meetings that bound scattered bands into something like a shared culture. You can imagine Lascaux or Altamira as the cathedrals of their landscapes, not in any literal architectural sense, but as central venues where identity was performed. Your group's stories, emblems, and alliances are inscribed in images that everyone recognizes. The bison and bulls are not just animals. They're tokens in a social game about who you are, who you're connected to, which rituals you observe. There's a catch, though, because Lascaux and Altamira are so visually overwhelming, they've shaped our expectations of Paleolithic art for over a century. For a long time, the unspoken model was, cave art culminates in big, polychrome, naturalistic animals. Anything simpler, smaller, or more abstract was seen as primitive, a step on the road toward the masterpieces. But as more sites have come to light, from subtle finger flutings to simple dots and lines to rougher engravings, it's become clear that Lascaux and Altamira are not the norm. They're outliers at the glamorous end of a huge, varied spectrum. Most Ice Age art is not giant bulls, it's hand stencils, scratched signs, small engravings on bone, modest panels tucked into awkward corners. If we only look through the lens of Lascaux, we risk missing what all those quieter marks were doing. So when we use these iconic sites as case studies, we have to hold two thoughts at once. They show us just how far the Magdalenian symbolic world could go when you throw resources and talent at it. Complex logistics, social coordination, maybe big public rituals. But they're also dangerous because they tempt us to assume this is what cave art really is, when in reality they're the equivalent of judging all of music by a single stadium concert. To understand the full story, we have to look beyond Europe altogether, to other continents, other caves, other traditions that never heard of bison ceilings or bull halls, but were clearly playing their own long game with pigment, rock, and memory. When the focus finally shifted beyond Europe, the first big shock came from a place that, for a long time, barely featured in Ice Age conversations at all, the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. For decades, the unspoken storyline went like this. Complex cave art really takes off in Europe. Maybe there were precursors elsewhere, but the real thing, naturalistic animals, careful shading, big compositions, that was a Franco-Cantabrian specialty. Other regions were assumed to be late adopters or to have simpler traditions that didn't quite reach the same symbolic punch. Then somebody put a drill into a little crust of rock over a hand stencil in Sulawesi. The technique they used is called uranium series dating. It doesn't date the pigment directly. Organic material for radiocarbon just isn't there, but it dates the calcite that slowly forms over the paintings as water drips and evaporates on the cave wall. Tiny uranium isotopes in the water decay into thorium at a known rate. Measure the ratio of uranium to thorium in that calcite skin, and you get the age of the crust. The painting underneath has to be at least that old. When researchers ran those numbers on several Sulawesi motifs, the dates came back at 40,000 years and older. One hand stencil was more than 39,000 years. A big ochre-red babirusa, a kind of wild pig with curling tusks, clocked in around 35,000, 45,000 years, depending on the sample. In other words, while people in Europe were outlining lions and rhinos in Chauvet, people in Indonesia were already blowing pigment around their hands and painting animals on rock. That doesn't just tweak the Europe first story, it snaps it. What makes Sulawesi so unnerving is not just the age, but the familiarity. You walk into these caves mentally through photos and scans, and you see negative hand stencils ringed along the walls, fingers spread, palms pressed flat. Some are single, others cluster in dense bands. The artists use the same basic technique as in Europe. Place the hand, then spray or blow pigment to leave a ghostly outline. You can almost hear the puff of air, feel the cool stone under your skin. Right next to those hands are animals, the babirusa, anoa, a dwarf buffalo, more stylized than the horses and bison of Lascaux, but clearly observed. Some figures have internal lines that might mark ribs or hair patterns. One panel shows several pigs in a group, maybe interacting. It's not the exact same visual language as France or Spain, but it's close enough that you instantly read it as the same kind of thing. Humans marking presence, humans marking animals, humans saying something in images deep underground. So what's going on here? One possibility is convergence. Wherever small bands of Homo sapiens found themselves with time, pigment and caves, they tended to do similar things. Trace their bodies, depict major prey or dangerous animals, experiment with repeated signs. Under this view, Sulawesi and Europe are parallel inventions. Symbolic mark-making is a general human capacity, and it keeps bubbling up independently. Another possibility leans more on shared roots. By 50,000, 60,000 years ago, humans leaving Africa may already have had a portable toolkit of symbolic behavior. Body painting, personal ornaments, abstract engravings on stone and bone, maybe even early rock art on surfaces that just didn't survive. As those groups fanned out along the coasts of Arabia, through South Asia, into Southeast Asia and eventually Europe, they carried not just genes but habits and conventions. Hand stencils in Sulawesi and Spain in this model are not coincidences so much as distant cousins, regional branches of a tradition already in circulation among expanding populations. The evidence we have can't fully discriminate between those scenarios. What it does say, pretty loudly, is that the ability to create stable symbolic records on rock was not a European quirk. By 40,000 years ago, people separated by thousands of miles of ocean and continent were both doing it, with techniques and themes that rhyme. But here's where we have to get careful. Our map of deep time art is not a neutral picture of the past. It's a picture of where modern funding, politics, geology and luck have allowed us to look. Europe is saturated with research teams, protected caves, and a century and a half of obsessive documentation. Sulawesi, Borneo, Australia, Southern Africa, the Indian subcontinent. They're catching up, but the coverage is patchy. Thick vegetation hides entrances. Tropical weather erases surfaces. Many sites are on private land or in politically sensitive regions. That means we're almost certainly seeing a biased sample. Rock shelters in dry limestone country survive and get famous. Open-air paintings on softer rock dissolve. Whole symbolic traditions might have existed on wood, bark, or unprotected cliff faces that have long since vanished, when a few spectacular Indonesian dates suddenly appear. It's not necessarily that art began there, at that moment. It might be that we've finally tripped over a small surviving remnant of something much broader. This leads to a deeper question that hangs over all of these discoveries. Are we looking at multiple independent origins of graphic symbolism, flaring up in different regions as populations grow dense and social worlds become more complex? Or are we tracking multiple survivals, isolated, lucky fragments of a much older, more continuous behaviour that once stretched across Africa and into the first exiting groups, most of which has been wiped away by time? Hand stencils in Sulawesi, lions in Chauvet, abstract signs in South Africa's Blombos Cave, enigmatic figures in Australian rock shelters. They might represent several separate inventions of let's leave marks that last, or they might be the scattered last pages of a lost archive, the only pieces tough enough to endure 40,000 years of erosion, tectonics and human indifference. Either way, the message is the same. The capacity to externalize memory and meaning onto stone is not late, not local, and not restricted to the glamorous caves of France and Spain. It's a deep, widespread feature of our species, emerging wherever conditions let it show, and vanishing just as easily when rocks weather, seas rise, or forests swallow the entrances. To figure out what Ice Age humans were really recording, we can't just listen to the loudest, best-lit European voices. We have to keep chasing faint echoes in places like Sulawesi, where a single red hand behind a calcite veil can quietly rewrite the origin story of art. So how do we chase those faint echoes without grinding the last traces of them into dust? For a long time, the basic methods were deceptively simple. A flashlight, a tape measure, a sketchbook, maybe a camera on a tripod. That's how most of the classic sites were documented. People literally lay on their backs in those tunnels with pencils, copying outlines by hand. Today, the caves are being reread with a very different toolkit. Start with the walls themselves. High-resolution photogrammetry and laser scanning let researchers turn a cramped, twisting passage into a manipulable 3D model accurate down to millimeters, sometimes less. You take hundreds, even thousands of overlapping photographs from slightly different angles, feed them into software, and out comes a detailed digital skin of the cave. Every bump, crack, and faint line is captured. Once you have that, you can do things no human body can. Rotate an entire chamber as if it were a toy model. Strip away torch flicker and uneven flashlight beams. Zoom in on a tiny corner without risking a helmet scrape against fragile calcite. And when you do that, things start to appear. Lines you'd written off as random scratches suddenly resolve into deliberate engravings. What looked like a single bison gains a second outline slightly offset, hinting at either a correction, a second phase of drawing, or an attempt to show movement. Scratches running under a painted horse, not over it, tell you the engraving came first and the painting later. In some panels, 3D models reveal stacked generations, older, faintly pecked animals, then a wash of pigment, then a later engraving cutting through both. In places like Lascaux, this layering gets so dense that the real composition isn't what your eyes see in one glance on the wall. It's a palimpsest built over centuries, maybe longer, that only becomes legible when you can toggle layers in a virtual cave, like turning pages in a book. Then there's the paint itself. Under a microscope, what looks like a flat swath of red or black becomes a field of grains, clumps, and tiny impurities. Those grains carry signatures, the size and shape of iron oxide particles in an ochre, the mix of manganese minerals in a black, the presence of certain trace elements. These can tie a pigment to a particular outcrop miles away. Chemists run tiny samples through techniques like Raman spectroscopy or chromatography, not to destroy the painting, but to sniff out its molecular structure. They find binders, animal fat, plant resins, maybe blood or egg. They see whether the pigment was used straight from the rock or carefully ground, heated, mixed with something to change its texture or colour fastness. That's recipe knowledge. When you realise that people in different caves, separated by tens of kilometres, are using nearly identical mixes, you start to suspect a shared tradition. When one chamber has unusually fine grinding or unusual mineral combinations, it looks more like a workshop with its own house style. And crucially, a lot of this can now be done without scraping anything at all. Portable XRF, X-ray fluorescence, lets researchers point a handheld device at the wall and read the elemental composition of the surface. The machine sends in a small pulse of X-rays. Atoms in the pigment respond with a characteristic signal. From that, you can tell iron from manganese, or spot trace elements that fingerprint a quarry. Combined with other non-invasive methods, infrared imaging to see carbon-based lines under calcite, ultraviolet to highlight certain organic residues, you can build a pretty detailed chemical biography of a painting without taking so much as a dust speck. That matters because some of these surfaces are basically non-renewable. You don't get a second chance. But pigments and 3D scans only take us so far. What about the code itself? Those abstract signs, dots, lines, chevrons, hooks, possible vulvas, weird comb shapes show up again and again across regions and millennia. It's tempting to say clearly a shared language of symbols. Maybe numbers, maybe seasons, maybe clans. Now that we have big digitized databases of motifs from dozens of caves, we can actually test how shared that symbolic system really was. Researchers use tools borrowed from social network analysis. Each sign type is a node. Each co-occurrence on a panel or in a cave is a link. Feed in the data and patterns emerge. Which signs almost always travel together, which are loners, which cluster strongly in certain regions or time periods. You can ask questions like, do certain combinations behave like a phrase or formula, reappearing across distant sites more often than chance would predict? Are there dialects of signs, sets used in one valley but not another? Do new motifs appear, spread, then vanish, the way fashions or technical notations move through modern cultures? Some early work suggests that yes, there is structure. The signs are not random doodles. Certain motifs have astonishingly long lives, showing up from early to late Upper Paleolithic. Others are tightly local, but we're still in the baby stages of this kind of analysis. And now, of course, AI wants to get in on the act. On one level, it's ideal for this problem. Pattern recognition across noisy, fragmentary data is what modern machine learning systems excel at. You can train algorithms on thousands of sign occurrences, ask them to cluster motifs without preconceptions or flag faint, eroded shapes a human eye might miss in a scan. AI could help standardize how we recognize a dot versus a short bar, reduce the subjective bias of one researcher seeing significance where another doesn't. It can spit out probability maps. This cave's sign system looks statistically closer to that cave 400 kilometers away than the one next door. But there's a catch. AI is also very good at hallucinating structure, finding faces in clouds at industrial scale. Given enough freedom, a model will happily tell you that every collection of lines is an encoded lunar calendar, or that every cluster of dots matches a modern constellation, because it's forced to find patterns even where none may exist. So the burden of proof doesn't go away. It gets heavier. Any AI-discovered code still has to be checked against archaeological context, dating, ethnography, and plain old common sense. If the supposed pattern requires Ice Age hunters to maintain an error-free pan-Eurasian symbol system over 10,000 years with no drift, that's probably a red flag. The future, if we're honest, will be a mix of dazzling revelations and hard limits. Better scans will almost certainly reveal more layers. Older engravings under paintings we thought were the first ghost motifs we never knew existed. Pigment chemistry may map trade networks we've only guessed at, showing mineral signatures moving hundreds of kilometers. Network analysis and AI might identify stable phrases of signs that really do behave like proto-notations regular, constrained, used in contexts that scream this means something specific. But some questions may stay stubbornly out of reach. Even if we prove that a certain trio of marks keeps showing up near pregnant animals, or at cave entrances, or in specific seasons, the leap from consistent use to they meant exactly this might be a bridge too far. Symbolic systems can carry multiple layers, practical, ritual, personal. Without living speakers, translation stays approximate. What these tools are doing, though, is shifting the balance. We're moving from staring at a handful of famous panels and arguing by analogy to treating the global Ice Age art record as a dataset. Scarred, partial, biased, but analyzable. Each new scan, each tiny chemical trace, each cautious statistical pattern turns the caves a little more from mystery icons into archives. And that in turn sharpens the final question we have to confront. If these people were investing this much effort, over this much time, into leaving durable, structured marks in the dark, what exactly were they trying to hold on to? If we strip away the wishful thinking and the sci-fi decoding fantasies, what's left is already astonishing. They were choosing very specific spaces, often the hardest to reach, and returning to them over generations. They were using refined techniques, consistent recipes, and repeated symbols. They were layering images in ways that respect earlier work or deliberately overwrite it. None of that looks casual. The safest reading is that we're looking at a plural use system. In some caves, panels read like concentrated knowledge, animal behavior, movement routes, critical moments in the year. In others, the emphasis feels more like identity, clan marks, hand stencils, signatures of "we were here." Ritual is almost certainly in the mix. Initiation spaces, death spaces, places to renegotiate luck with whatever powers you think move the herds and the weather. Maybe in some cases a rough calendar or sequence marker, timekeeping stitched into images rather than written beside them. If that feels too advanced for people 20,000 or 40,000 years ago, that's our bias talking, not the evidence. The more we study them, the less these painters look like stumbling proto-humans, and the more they look like us. Symbol-using, future-oriented, obsessed with not letting important things slip away. The big questions remain open. Were certain signs tightly standardized across regions, or do they drift like dialects? Can we tie specific motifs to specific seasons through independent dating of soot, calcite, and animal remains? Will we ever find a site where paintings, portable objects, and burials line up cleanly enough to fix one meaning beyond reasonable doubt? Those are the kinds of discoveries that could actually move debates from plausible story to probable function. Until then, interpretation lives in a grey zone. And that's where you come in. You've seen the evidence, the skill, the repetition, the deep investment in marking stone. What do you think they were trying hardest to remember? Knowledge, ancestors, spirits, migrations, seasons, some mix of all of it. Share your thoughts in the comments and try to keep it generous. Nobody alive has the final answer, including me. I really do read what you write, and I'd love to see the range of ways you're connecting with these people. And while you're there, let me ask a favour. If you found this interesting, please hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. I'm always amazed by how far and wide these videos travel through time zones. If you want to support the channel in the most helpful way, the best thing you can do is listen on Spotify. The link is down in the description.